All right, so what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. The time where I'm at right now is 3:16 p.m., and it is November 1st, 2024. Oh, this year is flying by so fast. For people that don't know, I am a 34-year-old man going back to university out here in Budapest, going to get my sociology degree, starting all over, starting with my bachelor's again. So being an undergrad, I already have an undergrad degree in music industry studies, but we're going to do this because it's cheaper abroad. And I really want to do something else besides teaching English for the rest of my life. The goal is to become a sociology professor, writer, public intellectual, et cetera, et cetera. Hell, might run for president one day. I don't think they'll let me in the White House. But anyway, this is part 6 of the Booked React series. This is the 6th book that we're reading by Earl Babbie. We're reading his classic, The Practice of Social Research. And this is a book that is somewhat required reading for my Introduction to Sociological Research class. And this is a subject that I absolutely loathe. I detest. I do not like this subject at all, but I'm reading the book because I don't want to fail. I actually want to pass my grades. I actually want to pass my classes and make good grades. So that's why we're going to be reading this book, and we're just going to be blowing through it. I've been sick the past like 3-4 days. In fact, I'm still a bit sick now. You get what I'm saying? So Sam Seals jumped in and he says, you got a PhD in being a whole ass Negro. So you know what? We're going to remove him as a standard moderator. We'll do that just to make that absolutely clear, because we're not having trolls in here. We're not going to tolerate that. We're here to increase the level of intelligence for people. So nobody's going to get me out of my character today. But anyway, so we started last time on chapter 1 of Earl Babbie's book, and we're going to be continuing with that. And for the past 3 days, I've been sick. In fact, I'm still sick right now a little bit, and hopefully I don't sneeze or cough too much during this live stream. So let's review a little bit of what we learned in chapter 1, and we're going to be finishing all of chapter 2. I have a class at 6 p.m., so I might have to leave early, but I might come back. You get what I'm saying? So anyway, let's go back here. Chapter 1, Human Inquiry and Science. And he basically was giving an introduction of, the field of social research and that sort of stuff. One of the vocabulary words he left for us: epistemology, the science of knowing; systems of knowledge; and methodology, the science of finding out; procedures for scientific investigation. All right. Moving forward, another definition he left for us was agreement reality, those things we know as parts and parcel of the culture we share with those around us. Moving forward, as well, he left a definition here: replication, repeating a research study to test and either confirm or question the findings of an earlier study. Moving forward here, we have this here, which is theory, a systematic explanation for the observations that relate to a particular aspect of life, juvenile delinquency, for example, or perhaps social stratification or political revolution. And moving forward here, we have a definition for what are the other words? Concepts, variables. Yes, this was one of the attributes and variables. This was something that I really had to grasp during my last reading. Variables, logical sets of attributes. The variable sex is made up of the attributes male and female, and attributes, characteristics of people or things. Moving forward here, he gave some examples of attributes and variables and how to think about it and understand it, many different concepts as well. Moving forward here, Sam Seals left a, for some reason, Sam Seals left me a super chat, but then also wanted to call me a beach ass Negro. Okay. I don't know what is happening in Australia, what's making some black men be haters of other black men. But I'm out here trying to raise the consciousness of the people. If you don't like it, you don't have to watch it. But I appreciate the super chat, buddy. I appreciate that. Let's continue here. Independent variable. That's a variable with values that are not problematic in an analysis, but are taken as simply given. An independent income is partly a function of amounts of formal education. Income is being treated as a dependent variable. All right. Does that make sense? That was the biggest concept, I think, for everything we studied last time in this book. Independent and dependent variables, right? The idea, for example, how much education you have, that's a dependent variable, and that's an independent variable, and how much money you make, that's dependent on how much education you have, for example, right? Does that make sense? That makes sense, people? Okay, moving on. moving on, we're going to pick up here. We're going to pick up here where we're going to start this says, oh, idiographic and nomothetic. Yes. Well, this is one more thing we have to review. Idiographic, an approach to explanation in which we seek to exhaust the idiosyncratic causes of a particular condition or event. Imagine trying to list all the reasons why you chose to attend your particular college. Given all those reasons, it's difficult to imagine you making any other choice. All right. Sam Sills says, you was talking real crazy last time. Yeah, I was saying, I think the last time you came here, Sam Seals, we finally got to the bottom of like what's happening in California with black men, and we realized there are no black men in California. Yes, I remember that very explicitly. There are no black men in California because y'all let the Mexicans just basically run the whole state and got y'all running from the Bay to Sacramento. I basically got niggas out in Oregon and stuff like that. I remember that. I remember that very vividly. And I'm glad that you came back, but hope Australia is doing well. Watch out for them giant mosquitoes. Watch out for them giant mosquitoes and spiders. Anyway, continuing here. Nomothetic, an approach to explanation in which we seek to identify a few causal factors that generally impact a class of conditions or events. Imagine the 2 or 3 key factors that determine which colleges students choose: proximity, reputation, and so forth. All right, and induction, the logical model in which general principles are developed from specific observations. Having noted that Jews and Catholics are more likely to vote Democratic than Protestants are, you might conclude that religious minorities in the United States are more affiliated with the Democratic Party, and then your task is to explain why. This would be an example of deduction. All right, Sam Seal says, I'm not even black, you tether. All right, I'll tell that to the police next time. I'll tell that to the police when the police show up and say, freeze, nigga, get down on the ground. I'll tell them, hey, sorry, guys, I'm not black. I'm a tether. I'm a dirty, musty tether. Yes, yes. I'll tell them that, Sam Seals. I'll appreciate that. Let's see. Where were we? Think we were on, yes, inductive and deductive theory. Let's go. So we're going to start here. We're going to start here, finish up chapter 1, finish up chapter 2. Y'all be along for the ride. Y'all come and learn, grab your popcorn, grab some notes, because this is a class. This is a class here. Sam came here to roast. That's why your hairline is gone, trying to blend in. Okay. All right, sure. Yes, and Michael Jordan was trying to blend in. Tupac was trying to blend in. Okay. Montel Williams was trying to blend in. Yes, yes. We're all just trying to blend in. I'm a dirty, musty tether. Appreciate the super chat. Hope that makes you feel good. Whatever. Continuing here. Like idiographic and nomothetic forms of explanation, inductive and deductive thinking both play a role in our daily lives. They too represent an important variation within social research. There are 2 routes to the conclusion that you do better on exams if you study with others. On the one hand, you might find yourself puzzling halfway through your college career why you do so well on exams sometimes, but poorly at other times. You might list all the exams you've taken, noting how well you did on each. Then you might try to recall any circumstances shared by all the good exams and by all the poor ones. Did you do better on multiple choice exams or essay exams, morning exams or afternoon exams, exams in the natural sciences, the humanities, or the social sciences, times when you studied alone, or Shazam? It occurs to you that you have almost always done best on exams when you studied with others. This mode of inquiry is known as induction. Induction, or inductive reasoning, moves from the particular to the general, from a set of specific observations to the discovery of a pattern that represents some degree of order among all the given events. Notice, incidentally, that your discovery doesn't necessarily tell you why the pattern exists, just that it does. There is a second and very different way that you might arrive at the same conclusion about studying for exams. Imagine approaching your first set of exams in college. You wonder about, moving on, you wonder about the best ways to study, how much you should review the readings, how much you should focus on your class notes. You learn that some students prepare by rewriting their notes in an orderly fashion. Then you consider whether you should study at a measured pace or else pull an all-nighter just before the exam. Among these kinds of musings, you might ask whether you should get together with other students in the class or just study on your own. You could evaluate the pros and cons of both both options. Studying with others might not be as efficient because a lot of the time might be spent on things you already understand. On the other hand, you can understand something better when you've explained it to someone else, and other students might understand parts of the course that you haven't gotten yet. Several minds can reveal perspectives that might have escaped you. Also, your commitment to study with others, with others makes it more likely that you'll study rather than watch the special Here Comes Honey Boo Boo retrospective. Okay. In this fashion, you might add up the pros and the cons and conclude logically that you benefit from studying with others. It seems reasonable to you in the same way it seems reasonable that you'll do better if you study rather than not. Sometimes we say things like this are true in theory. To complete the practice, to complete the process, we test whether they are true in practice. For a complete test, you might study alone for half your exams and study with others for the other exams. This procedure would test your logical reasoning. This second mode of inquiry, known as deduction or deductive reasoning, moves from the general to the specific. It moves from one, a pattern that might be logically or theoretically expected, to two, observations that test whether the expected pattern actually occurs. Notice the deduction begins with why and moves to whether, whereas induction moves in the opposite direction. Continuing here. So once again, let's keep this clear about deduction, the logical model in which specific expectations or hypotheses are developed on the basis of general principles. Starting from the general principle that all deans are meanies, you might anticipate that this one won't let you change courses. This anticipation would be the result of deduction. Got it. Got it. All right. So deducing, coming to a conclusion about something based on, previous expectations. So here's induction and deduction. So in induction, right, the wheel of science. All right. So the theory and research cycle for the social sciences can be compared to a relay race, although all participants do not necessarily start or stop at the same point. They share a common goal: to examine all levels of social life. So induction, we start from empirical generalizations to theories, hypotheses, and then to observations. And in deduction, we start from hypotheses, observations, empirical generalizations, and then theories. Interesting. All right, so going here. As you'll see later in this book, these two very different approaches both serve as valid avenues for science. Each approach can stimulate the research process, prompting the researcher to take on specific questions and framing the manner in which they are addressed. Moreover, you'll see how induction and deduction work together to provide ever more powerful and complete understandings. Figure 1 through 3 shows how these two approaches interact in the practice of social research. Notice, by the way, that the distinction between deductive and inductive reasoning is not necessarily linked to the distinction between nomothetic and ideographic modes of explanation. These 4 characterizations represent 4 possibilities in everyday life as much as in social research. For example, ideographically and deductively, you might prepare for a particular date by taking into account everything you know about the person you're dating, trying to anticipate logically how you can prepare, what type of clothing, behavior, hairstyle, oral hygiene, and so forth will likely produce a successful date. Or ideographically and inductively, you might try to figure out what it was exactly that caused your last date to call 911 and subsequently seek a restraining order. This guy's got jokes. This got jokes. Earl Babbie's got jokes. A nomothetic deductive approach arises when you coach others on your rules of dating, when you wisely explain why their dates will be impressed to hear them expound on the dangers of satanic messages concealed in rock and roll lyrics. When you later review your life and wonder why you didn't date more musicians, you might engage in nomothetic induction. We'll return to induction and deduction in Chapter 2. Let's turn now to a third broad distinction that generates rich variations in social research: determinism versus agency. The 2 preceding sections are based implicitly on a more fundamental issue. As you pursue your studies of social research and methods, particularly when you examine causation and explanation and data analysis, you will come face to face with one of the most nagging dilemmas in the territory bridging social research and social philosophy: determinism versus agency. As you explore examples of causal social research, this issue comes to a head. Imagine that you have a research grant to study the causes of racial prejudice. Having created a reasonable measure of prejudice so you can distinguish those with higher or lower degrees of prejudice, you will be able to explore its causes. You may find, for example, that people living in certain regions of the country are, overall, more prejudiced than those living in other regions. Certain political orientations seem to promote prejudice, as do certain religious orientations. Economic insecurities may increase prejudice and result in the search for scapegoats. Or If you are able to determine something about your subject's upbringing, the degree of prejudice expressed by their parents, for example, you may discover more causes of prejudice. Typically, none of these causes will be definitive, but each adds to the likelihood of a subject being prejudiced. Imagine, for example, a woman who was raised in a generally prejudiced region by prejudiced parents. She now holds political and religious views that support such prejudice and feels at risk of losing her job. When you put all those causes together, the likelihood of such a person being prejudiced is very high. Notice the significance of the word likelihood in this discussion. As indicated earlier in this chapter, social researchers deal with a probabilistic causation. Thus, the convergence of all the causes of prejudice mentioned here, scrolling up, would produce a high probability that the person in question would appear prejudiced in our measurements. Even though the determinism involved in this approach is not perfect, it is deterministic all the same. Missing in this analysis is what is variously called choice, free will, or as social researchers tend to refer, agency. What happened to the individual? How do you feel about the prospect of being a subject in such an analysis? Let's say you consider yourself an unprejudiced person. Are you willing to say you were destined to turn out that way because of forces and factors beyond your control? Probably not. And yet, that's the implicit logic behind the causal analysis that social researchers so often engage in. The philosophical question here is whether humans are determined by their particular environments or whether they feel and act out of their personal choice or agency. I cannot pretend to offer an ultimate answer to this question, which has challenged philosophers and others throughout the history of human consciousness. But I can share the working conclusion I have reached as a result of observing and analyzing human behavior over a few decades. I've tentatively concluded that 1, each of us possesses considerable free choice or agency, but 2, we readily allow ourselves to be controlled by environmental forces and factors, such as those described earlier in the example of prejudice. As you explore the many examples of causal analysis in this book and elsewhere in the social research literature, this giving away of agency will become obvious. More shocking, if you pay attention to the conversations of daily life, yours as well as those of others, you will find that we constantly deny having choice or agency. Consider these few examples. I couldn't date someone who smokes. I couldn't tell my mother that. I couldn't work in an industry that manufactures nuclear weapons. The list could go on for pages, but I hope this makes the point. In terms of human agency, you could do any of these things, although you might choose not to. However, you rarely explain your behavior or feeling on the basis of choice. If your classmates suggest you join them at a party or the movies and you reply, I can't, I have an exam tomorrow. In fact, you could blow off the exam and join them, but you choose not to, right? However, you rarely take responsibility for such a decision. You blame it on external forces. Why did the professor have to give an exam the day after the big party? This situation is very clear in the case of love. Which of us ever chooses to love someone or to be in love? Instead, we speak of falling in love, sort of like catching a cold or falling in a ditch. The iconic anthem for this point of view is the set of 1913 lyrics, courtesy of songwriter Joseph McCarthy. You made me love you. I didn't want to do it. As I said at the outset of this discussion, the dilemma of determinism versus agency continues to bedevil philosophers, and you will find its head poking up from time to time throughout this book. I can't give you an ultimate answer to it, but I wanted to alert you to its presence. The question of responsibility is an important aspect of this issue. Although it lies outside the realm of this book, I would like to bring it up briefly. Social research occurs in the context of a socio-political debate concerning who is responsible for a person's situation and their experiences in life. If you are poor, for example, are you responsible for your low socioeconomic status, or does the responsibility lie with other people, organizations, or institutions? Social research typically looks for ways that social structures, from interaction patterns to whole societies, affect the experiences and situations of individual members of society. Thus, your poverty might be a consequence of being born into a very poor family and having little opportunity for advancement, or the closing of a business, exporting jobs overseas, or a global recession might lie at the root of your poverty. Notice that this approach works against the notion of agency that we have discussed. Moreover, while social scientists tend to feel social problems should be solved at the At the societal level, yes. At the societal level through legislation, for example, this is a disempowering view for an individual. If you take the point of view that your poverty, bad grade, or rejected job application is a result of forces beyond your control, then you are conceding that you have no power. There is more power in assuming that you have it than assuming you are the helpless victim of circumstances. You can do this without denying the power of social forces around you. In fact, you may exercise your individual responsibility by setting out to change the social forces that have an impact on your social life. This complex view calls for a healthy tolerance for ambiguity, which is an important ability in the world of social research. Very interesting. I don't know. I kind of tend to believe we don't have free will. I kind of don't believe in free will. I think everything is sort of determined. But we have the freedom to not know what our will be, if that makes sense. Like we don't know what will be ahead of us. So we live in a state of living like there is free will, which is close to free will as it might seem, but there's no other action other than the action that you will take, right? Uh, because time is linear, because time is moving linear and we cannot stop it to some degree. We can't stop it at all, at least in this point in human development. Because we can't stop time, I don't believe there's free will, right? Anyway, continuing here. The ability to hold conflicting ideas in your mind simultaneously without denying or dismissing any of them, that's tolerance for ambiguity, okay? Something I think MAGA lacks. Continuing here. Qualitative and quantitative data. So the distinction between qualitative and quantitative data in social research is essentially the distinction between numerical and non-numerical data. When we say someone is intelligent, we've made a qualitative assertion. A corresponding assertion about someone less fortunately endowed will be that he or she is unintelligent. When psychologists and others measure intelligence by IQ scores, they are attempting to quantify such qualitative assessments. For example, the psychologist might say that a person has an IQ of 120. Every observation is qualitative at the outset, whether it is our experience of someone's intelligence, the location of a pointer on a measuring scale, or a check mark entered in a questionnaire. None of these things is inherently numerical or quantitative, but converting them to a numerical form is sometimes useful. Chapter 14 of this book will deal specifically with the quantification of data. Quantification often makes our observations more explicit. It also can make it easier to aggregate, compare, and summarize data. Further, it opens up the possibility of statistical analyses, ranging from simple averages to complex formulas and mathematical models. Quantitative data then offer the advantages that numbers have over words as measures of some quality. On the other hand, they also carry the disadvantage that numbers have, including a potential loss in richness of meaning. For example, a social researcher might want to know whether college students aged 18 to 22 tend to date people older or younger than themselves. A quantitative answer to this question seems easily attained. The researcher asks a given number of college students how old each of their dates has been, calculates an average, and compares it with the age of the subject. Case closed. Or is it? Although age here represents a number of years people have been alive, sometimes people use the term differently. Perhaps for some, age really means maturity. You may date people who are younger than you, but who act more maturely than others of their age, and thus represent the same age as you. Or someone might see age as how young or old your date looks, or maybe the degree of variation in their life experiences and worldliness. These latter meanings would be lost in the quantitative calculation of average age. Qualitative data, in short, can be richer in meaning than quantified data. This is implicit in the cliche, he is older than his years. The poetic meaning of this expression would be lost in attempts to specify how much older. On the other hand, qualitative data bring the disadvantages of purely verbal descriptions. For example, the richness of meaning I've mentioned is partly a function of ambiguity. If the expression older than his years meant something to you when you read it, that meaning came from your own experiences, from people you have known who might fit the description of being older than their years, or perhaps from the times you have heard others use that expression. Two things about this phrase are certain. You and I probably don't mean exactly the same thing when we say it. And two, if I say it, you don't know exactly when I mean, and vice versa. I have a friend, Ray Zhang, who was responsible for communications at the 1989 freedom demonstrations in Tiananmen Square, Beijing. Following the army clampdown, Ray fled south, was arrested, and then was released with orders to return to Beijing. Instead, he escaped from China and made his way to Paris. Eventually, he came to the United States, where he resumed the graduate studies he had been forced to abandon in fleeing his homeland. I have seen him deal with the difficulties of getting enrolled in school without any transcripts from China, of studying in a foreign language, of meeting his financial needs all on his own, thousands of miles from his family. Ray still speaks of one day returning to China to build a system of democracy. When I first met him, Ray struck me as someone older than his years. The additional detail in my qualitative description, while it fleshes out the meaning of the phrase, still does not equip us to say how much older, or even to compare two people in these terms without the risk of disagreeing as to which one is more worldly. It might be possible to quantify this concept, however. For example, we might establish a list of life experiences that would contribute to what we mean by worldliness. For example, getting married, getting divorced, having a parent die, seeing a murder committed, Jesus, being arrested, being exiled, being fired from a job, running away with the circus. Okay, we might quantify people's worldliness as the number of such experiences they've had. The more such experiences, the more worldly we'd say they were. If we thought of some experiences as more powerful than others, we could give those experiences more points. Once we had made our list and point system, scoring people and comparing their worldliness on a numerical scale would be straightforward. We would have no difficulty agreeing on who had more points than who. To quantify a non-numerical concept like worldliness, then, we need to be explicit about what the concept means. By focusing explicitly on what we'll include in our measurement of the concept, however, we also exclude any other meanings. Inevitably, then, we face a trade-off. Any explicated quantitative measure will be less rich in meaning than the corresponding qualitative description. What a dilemma. Which approach should we choose? Which is better? Which is more appropriate to social research? The good news is that we don't need to choose. In fact, we shouldn't. Both qualitative and quantitative methods are useful and legitimate in social research. Some research situations and topics are amenable to qualitative examination, others to quantification. Although researchers may use both, these two approaches call for different skills and procedures. As a result, you may find that you feel more comfortable with and become more adept in one or the other. You will be a stronger researcher, however, to the extent that you can use both approaches effectively. Certainly, all researchers, whatever their personal inclinations, should recognize the legitimacy of both. You may have noticed that the qualitative approach seems more aligned with ideographic explanations, while nomothetic explanations are more easily achieved through quantification. Although this is true, these relationships are not absolute. Moreover, both approaches present considerable gray area. Recognizing the distinction between qualitative and quantitative research doesn't mean that you must identify your research activities with one to the exclusion of the other. A complete understanding of a topic often requires both techniques. The contributions of these two approaches are widely recognized today. For example, when Stuart J. H. Biddle and his colleagues, 2001, at the University of Wales set out to review the status of research in the field of sport and exercise psychology, they were careful to examine the uses of both quantitative and qualitative techniques, drawing attention to those they felt were underused. The apparent conflict between these two fundamental approaches has been neatly summarized by Paul Thompson in 2004 in his book written sometime, and I don't know the title of the book, but page 238 to 239. Only a few sociologists would openly deny the logic of combining the strengths of both quantitative and qualitative methods in social research. In practice, however, despite such wider methodological aspirations in principle, social researchers have regrettably become increasingly divided into two camps, many of whose members know little of each other, even if they are not explicitly hostile. In reviewing the frequent disputes over the superiority of qualitative or quantitative methods, Anthony Onwuegbuzi Anthony Onwuegbuzi and Nancy Leach in 2005 suggest that the two approaches have more similarities than differences, and they urge that social research is strengthened by the use of both. My intention in this book is to focus on the complementarity, complementarity, complementarity. I didn't know that's a word. The complementarity of these two approaches rather than on any apparent competition between them. All right, the research proposal. All right. So I conclude this chapter by introducing a feature that will run throughout the book, the preparation of a research proposal. Most organized research begins with the description of what is planned in the project, including what questions it will raise and how it will answer them. Often such proposals are created for the purpose of getting the resources needed to conduct the research envisioned. One way to learn the topics of this course is to write a research proposal based on what you have learned. Even if you will not actually conduct a major research project, you can lay out a plan for doing so. Your instructor may use this as a course requirement, but even if that's not the case, you can use the proposing social research exercise at the end of each chapter to test your mastery of the subject. There are many organizational structures for research proposals, and I've created a fairly typical one for you to use with this book. I've presented the proposal outline as follows, indicating which chapters in the book deal most directly with each topic. We have introduction, chapter 1, review of the literature, chapters 2, 17, and appendix A, specifying the problems and question and topic, chapters 5, 6, and 12, research design in chapter 4, data collection methods, chapters 4, 8, 9, 10, and 11, selection of subjects, chapter 7, ethical issues, chapter 3, data analysis, chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16, and bibliography, chapter 17, appendix A. I'll have more to say about each of these topics as we move through the book, beginning with this chapter's proposing social research exercise. Chapter 4 will have an extended section on the research proposal, and chapter 17 will give you an opportunity to pull together all the parts of the proposal into a coherent whole. All right. Moving on. So these are the main points. These are the main points, summaries of chapter 1. Summaries of chapter 1. Let's go. So in the introduction, we covered the subject of this book is how we find out about social reality. When under looking for reality, inquiry is a natural human activity. Much of ordinary human inquiry seeks to explain events and predict future events. When we understand through direct experience, we make observations and seek patterns of regularities in what we observe. Much of what we know by agreement rather by experience. In particular, two important sources of agreed on knowledge are traditional and authority. However, these useful sources of knowledge can also lead us astray. Science seeks to protect against the mistakes we make in day-to-day inquiry, whereas we often observe inaccurately. Researchers seek to avoid these errors by making observation a careful and deliberate activity. We sometimes jump to general conclusions on the basis of only a few observations, so scientists seek to avoid overgeneralization. They do this by committing themselves to a sufficient number of observations and by replicating studies. In everyday life, we sometimes reason illogically. Researchers seek to avoid illogical reasoning by being as careful and deliberate in their reasoning as in their observations. Moreover, the public nature of science means that others are always there to challenge faulty reasoning. The foundation of social science. Social theory attempts to discuss and explain what is, not what should be. Theory should not be confused with philosophy or belief. Social science looks for regularities in social life. Social scientists are interested in explaining human aggregates, not individuals. Theories are written in the language of variables. A variable is a logical set of attributes. An attribute is a characteristic. Sex, for example, is a variable made up of the attributes male and female. So is gender when those attributes refer to social rather than biological distinctions. In causal explanation, the presumed cause is the independent variable, and the effective variable is the dependent variable. The purpose of social research. Three major purposes of social research are exploration, description, and explanation. Studies may aim to serve more than one of these purposes. Some dialectics of social science. Whereas idiographic explanations present specific cases fully, nomothetic explanations present a generalized understanding of many cases. Inductive theories reasons Inductive theories reason from specific observations to general patterns. Deductive theories start from general statements and predict specific observations. Let's repeat. Whereas idiographic explanations present specific cases fully, nomothetic explanations present a generalized understanding of many cases. Inductive theories reason from specific observation to general patterns. Deductive theories start from general statements and predict specific observations. The underlying logic of traditional science implicitly suggests a deterministic cause and effect model in which individuals have no choice, although researchers do not say nor necessarily believe that. Some researchers are intent on focusing attention on the agency by which the subjects of study are active, choice making agents. The issue of free will versus determinism is an old one in philosophy, and people exhibit conflicting orientations in their daily behavior, sometimes proclaiming their freedom and other times denying it. Quantitative data are numerical, qualitative data are not. Both types of data are useful for different research purposes. The research proposal. Research projects often begin with the preparation of a research proposal, describing the purpose and methods of the proposed study. In this book, each chapter will conclude with an exercise through which you can prepare part of a research proposal, thereby testing your mastery of the topics covered. All right, and key terms. So the key terms we learned, the following terms are defined in context of the chapter and at the bottom of the page where the term is introduced, as well as in the comprehensive glossary at the back of the book. Agreement reality, that's agreement reality, attributes, deduction, dependent variable, epistemology, idiographic, independent variable, induction, methodology, nomothetic, replication, theory, tolerance for ambiguity, and variables. I got to learn those definitions. I feel like I know those definitions, but let's go here. Let's go here. So the first chapter has given you an overview of some of the basic variations in social research, many of which can be useful in writing the introduction of your research proposal. For this assignment, you should first identify a topic or question you might like to explore in a research project. Perhaps you would like to investigate some topics relating to race, gender, or social class. Perhaps there is some aspect of college life that you think needs study. Once you have a research topic in mind, this chapter will offer some ideas on how the research might be organized. This is only an overview of the project, and you should take 2 to 4 paragraphs. It will work best if you can select a topic that you'll use in each of the chapters of the book as you address different aspects of the research process. Here are some examples of research questions to illustrate the kind of focus your project might take. Do women earn less money than men? And if so, why? What causes support for or opposition to same-sex marriage? What distinguishes juvenile gangs of different ethnic groups? What academic departments at your college offer the broadest degree of liberal arts training? Is it true, as some suggest, that the United States was established as a Christian nation? Are American military actions in the Middle East reducing the threat of terrorist attacks in the United States or increasing those threats? All right. What are the major functions of the American family, and how have those been changing over time? Are official attempts to control illegal drug use succeeding or failing? Do undocumented immigrants overall represent a net economic cost or benefit to the United States? Almost certainly, you hear questions like these discussed frequently, both in your own interactions and in the mass media. Probably most of those discussions are largely based in opinions. Your opportunity in this course is to see how you might pursue such questions as a researcher, dealing with logic and facts in place of opinions. So review questions and exercise. So review the common errors of human inquiry discussed in this chapter. Find a magazine or newspaper article or perhaps a letter to the editor that illustrates one of those errors. Discuss how a scientist would avoid it. List 5 social variables and the attributes they comprise. Go to the website for one of the following organizations and find examples of both qualitative and quantitative data. UN High Commission Commissioner for Refugees, U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, National Library of Australia. I might do that homework. I might do this homework. This is homework I'm going to assign for myself. I'm going to do this after we're done reading this because I'm going to bother my teachers. I'm going to bother my teachers by sending them an email almost every day of me assigning myself homework after I get off live stream. All right. But yeah, that's the end of chapter 1. That's the end of chapter 1. That was not a lot. We're still at the low end of the increasing scope of this difficult topic of social research. One thing I want to read again, just to make sure I absolutely got it, because I don't feel like I grasped it fully. I'm going to read this line one more time about inductive and deductive theory, just to really knock it in my mind. Then we're going to jump to chapter 2 and knock it out the park. So let's go. Inductive and deductive theory. Like ideographic and nomothetic forms of explanation, inductive and deductive thinking both play a role in our daily lives. They too represent an important variation within social research. There are 2 routes to the conclusion that you do better on exams if you study with others. On the one hand, you might find yourself puzzling halfway through your college career why you do so well on exams sometimes but poorly at other times. Okay? You might list all the exams you've taken, noting how well you did on each. Then you might try to recall any circumstances shared by all the good exams and by all the poor ones. Okay, hold on. I got things messed up. Okay. You might list all the exams you've taken, noting how well you did on each. Then you might try to recall any circumstances shared by all the good exams and by all the poor ones. Did you do better on multiple choice exams or essay exams, morning exams or afternoon exams, exams in the natural sciences, the humanities, or the social sciences? Times when you studied alone or at Shazam, it occurs to you that you almost always did best on exams when you studied with others. This mode of inquiry is known as induction. Induction, or inductive reasoning, moves from the particular to the general, from a set of specific observations to the discovery of a pattern that represents some degree of order among all the given events. Notice, incidentally, that your discovery doesn't necessarily tell you why the pattern exists, just that it does. Okay. There is a second and very different way you might arrive at the same conclusion about studying for exams. Imagine approaching your first set of exams in college. You wonder about the best way to study, how much you should review the readings, how much you should focus on your class notes. You learn that some students prepare by rewriting these notes in an orderly fashion. Then you consider whether you should study at a measured pace or else pull an all-nighter just before the exam. Among these kinds of musings, you might ask whether you should get together with other students in the class or just study on your own. You could evaluate the pros and cons of both options. Studying with others might not be as efficient because a lot of time might be spent on things you already understand. On the other hand, you can understand something better when you've explained it to someone else, and other students might understand parts of the course that you haven't gotten yet. Several minds can reveal perspectives that might have escaped you. Also, your commitment to study with others makes it more likely that you'll study rather than watch the special Here Comes Honey Boo Boo retrospective. In this fashion, you might add up the pros and the cons and conclude logically that you'd benefit from studying with others. It seems reasonable to you in the same way it seems reasonable that you'll do better if you study rather than not. Sometimes we say things like this are true in theory. To complete the process, we test whether they are true in practice. For a complete test, you might study alone for half your exam and study with others for the other exams. This procedure would test your logical reasoning. This second mode of inquiry, known as deduction or deductive reasoning, moves from the general to the specific. It moves from a pattern that might be logically or theoretically expected, observations that test whether the expected pattern actually occurs. Notice the deduction begins with why and moves to whether, whereas induction moves in the opposite direction. Okay, I'm going to try to give a theory. I'm going to try to give an example to understand induction and deduction for myself. Okay, so I make the best chili. There's sometimes I make chili. Sometimes I make chili, it comes out really good. Sometimes I make chili and it comes out really bad. When I sit back and think about all the different ways that I cooked the chili and it came out good, the best conclusion that I can come to is that I used jalapeno pepper, not red pepper. And that's why the chili came out good, right? I think that would be inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, on the other hand, would be, for example, me sit back and I read different chili recipes and I find the ingredients and the process that I think would make the best chili. And that would be deductive by weighing the pros and cons, looking at what works, what doesn't work, and finding the best answer. That would be deductive reasoning. So I understand. Okay. All right. All right. We're going to skip all that. I think I get it now. And we're going to go to chapter 2. Chapter 2, paradigms, theory, and social research. So, chapter overview. What will we study? Social scientific inquiry is an interplay of theory and research, logic and observation, induction and deduction, and of the fundamental frames of reference known as paradigms. Okay. And here's everything that we'll study in here in chapter 2. And let's go. So, let's start here in the introduction. So, certain restaurants in the United States are fond of conducting political polls among the diners whenever an election is in the offing. Some take these polls very seriously because of their uncanny history of predicting winners. Some movie theaters have achieved similar success by offering popcorn in bags picturing either donkeys or elephants. Years ago, granaries in the Midwest offered farmers a chance to indicate their political preferences through the bags of grain they selected. Such idiosyncratic ways of determining trends, though interesting, all follow the same pattern over time. They work for a while and then they fail. Moreover, we can't predict when or why they will fail. These unusual polling techniques point to a significant shortcoming of research findings that are based only on the observation of patterns. Unless we can offer logical explanations for such patterns, the regularities we've observed may be mere flukes, chance occurrences. If you flip a coin long enough, you'll get 10 heads in a row. Scientists might adapt a street expression to describe the situations. Patterns happen. Okay. All right, Earl, Mr. Babbie, street expression. Come on now. All right. Uh, Logical explanations are what theories seek to provide. Theories function in three ways in research. First, they prevent our being taken in by flukes, pardon. If we can't explain why Ma's Diner has so successfully predicted elections, we run the risk of supporting a fluke. If we know why it has happened, we can anticipate whether or not it will work in the future. Second, theories make sense of observed patterns in a way that can suggest other possibilities. If we understand the reasons why broken homes produce more juvenile delinquency than intact homes do, lack of supervision, for example, we can take effective action, such as establishing after-school youth programs. Third, theories shape and direct research efforts, pointing toward likely discoveries through empirical observation. If you were looking for your lost keys on dark streets, you could whip your flashlight around randomly, hoping to chance upon the errant keys. Or you could use your memory or where you had been and limit your search to more likely areas. Theories, by analogy, direct researchers' flashlights where they will most likely observe interesting patterns of social life. This is not to say that all social science research is tightly intertwined with social theory. Sometimes social scientists undertake investigations simply to discover the state of affairs, such as an evaluation of whether an innovative social program is working or a poll to determine whether which candidate is winning a political race. Similarly, descriptive ethnographies, such as anthropological accounts of pre-literate societies, produce valuable information and insights in and of themselves. However, even studies such as these often go beyond pure description to ask why. Theory relates directly to why questions. This chapter explores some specific ways theory and research work hand in hand during the adventure of inquiry into social life. We'll begin by looking at some fundamental frames of reference called paradigms that underlie social theories and inquiry. Whereas social theories seek to explain, paradigms provide ways of looking. In and of themselves, paradigms don't explain anything. However, they provide logical frameworks within which theories are created. As you'll see in this chapter, theories and paradigms intertwine in the search for meaning in social life. All right, going back here to the definition before we continue. What is a paradigm? Paradigm, a model or frame of reference through which to observe and understand. All right, let's go here. So, some social science paradigms. There is usually more than one way to make sense of things in daily life. For example, liberals and conservatives often explain the same phenomenon, teenagers using guns at school, for example, quite differently. So might the parents and teenagers themselves. But underlying these different explanations or theories are paradigms, the fundamental models or frames of reference we use to organize our observations and reasoning. All right. Craig Mack up in here. He says, "What up, Simon? Yo, is it Kosovo or Macedonia? What do you suggest?" Macedonia all day. Macedonia all day. Beautiful country, weird people. You will not find a Macedonian that's not weird. Go there and enjoy Macedonia. Go there and enjoy Macedonia. Though Kosovo is much cheaper, much cheaper. Anyway, continuing here. Continuing here. All right, so paradigms are often difficult to recognize as such because they are so implicit, assumed, taken for granted. They seem much more like the way things are than like one possible point of view among many. Here's an illustration of what I mean. Where do you stand on the issue of human rights? Do you feel that individual human beings are sacred? Are they endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights as asserted by the U.S. Declaration of Independence? Are there some things that no government should do to its citizens? Let's get more concrete. In wartime, civilians are sometimes used as human shields to protect military targets. Sometimes they are impressed into slave labor or even used as mobile blood banks for military hospitals. How about organized programs of rape and murder in support of ethnic cleansing? Those of us who are horrified and incensed by such practices probably find it difficult to see our individualistic paradigm represented in concepts like human rights, liberty, human dignity as only one possible point of view among many. However, many cultures in today's world regard the Western and particularly US commitment to the sanctity of the individual as bizarre. Historically, it has decidedly been a minority viewpoint. Go in here to Greg Meck. He says, leaving Monday. Leaving from where? Hope you have a safe flight. Be safe out there. Stay ready wherever you go in this world. You feel me? All right. Continuing here. Although many Asian countries, for example, now subscribe to some rights that belong to individuals, those are balanced against the rights of families, organizations, and the society at large. Criticized for violating human rights, Asian leaders often point to high crime rates and social disorganization in Western societies as the cost of what they see as our radical cult of the individual. I won't try to change your points of view on individual human dignity, nor have I given up on my own. It's useful, however, to recognize that our views and feelings of this matter It's useful, however, to recognize that our views and feelings in this matter result from the paradigm we have been socialized into. The sanctity of the individual is not an objective fact of nature, it is a point of view, a paradigm. All of us operate within many such paradigms. When we recognize that we are operating within a paradigm, two benefits accrue. First, we can better understand and seemingly bizarre views and actions of others who are operating from a different paradigm. Second, at times we can profit from stepping outside our paradigm. Suddenly, we can see new ways of seeing and explaining things. We can't do that as long as we mistake our paradigm for reality. Paradigms play a fundamental role in science, just as they do in daily life. Thomas Kuhn, 1970, draws attention to the role of paradigms in the history of the natural sciences. Kuhn's classic book on this subject is titled, appropriately enough, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Major scientific paradigms have included such fundamental viewpoints as Copernicus's conception of the Earth moving around the sun instead of the reverse, Darwin's theory of evolution, Newtonian mechanics, and Einstein's relativity. Which scientific theories make sense depends on which paradigm scientists are maintaining. Although we sometimes think of science as developing gradually over time, marked by important discoveries and inventions, Kuhn says that scientific paradigms typically become entrenched, resisting substantial change. Thus, theories and research alike tend to follow a given fundamental direction. Eventually, however, as the shortcomings of a particular paradigm become obvious, a new one emerges and supplants the old. The seemingly natural view that the rest of the universe revolves around the Earth, for example, compelled astronomers to devise ever more elaborate ways to account for the motions of heavenly bodies that they actually observed. Eventually, however, the shortcomings of that paradigm would become obvious in the form of observation that violated the expectations suggested by the paradigm. These are often referred to as anomalies, events that fall outside expected or standard patterns. For a long time in American society, as elsewhere, a fundamental belief system regarding sex and gender held that only men were capable of higher learning. In that situation, every demonstrably learned woman was an anomalous challenge to the traditional view. When the old paradigm was sufficiently challenged, Kuhn suggested a new paradigm would emerge and supplant the old one. Social scientists have developed several paradigms for understanding social behavior. The fate of supplanted paradigms in the social sciences, however, has differed from what Kuhn observed in the natural sciences. Natural scientists generally believe that the succession from one paradigm to another represents progress from a false view to a true one. For example, no modern astronomer believes that the sun revolves around the earth, except Jay-Z. Except Jay-Z. In the social sciences, on the other hand, theoretical paradigms may gain or lose popularity, but they are seldom discarded altogether. The paradigms of the social sciences offer a variety of views, each of which offers insight the others lack and ignores aspects of social life that the others reveal. Ultimately, paradigms are neither true nor false as ways of looking. They are only more or less useful. Each of the paradigms we are about to examine offers a different way of looking at human social life. Each makes its own assumption about the nature of social reality. As we'll see, each one can open up new understandings, suggest different kinds of theories, and inspire different kinds of research. All right. So Craig Mass says, leaving from the Tesla airport in Serbia, which broads are better, in Kosovo or Macedonia? In Kosovo, they got those big old knockers, but they also got big old noses. In Macedonia, you got just the just top tier snow bunnies. You have top tier Becky's, Christina's, in this case, Militsas. If that's what you're into, that's what you'll find in Macedonia. All right. Continuing here. Macro theory and micro theory. Let's begin with the difference between concerning focus. Let's begin with the difference concerning focus, a difference that stretches across many of the paradigms we'll discuss. Some social theorists focus their attention on society at large, or at least on large portions of it. Topics of study for such macro theories include the struggle between economic classes in a society, international relations, or the interrelations among major institutions in society, such as governments, religion, and family. Macro theory deals with large aggregate entities of societies or even whole societies. Note that some researchers prefer to limit the macro level to whole societies, using the term mesotheory for an intermediate level between macro and micro, studying organizations, communities, and perhaps social categories such as gender. Here's macro theory. A theory aimed at understanding the big picture of institutions, whole societies, and the interactions among societies. Karl Marx's examination of the class struggle is an example of macro theory. Micro theory, a theory aimed at understanding social life at the intimate levels of individuals and their interactions. Examining how the play behavior of girls differs from that of boys will be an example of micro theory. All right, go in here. All right. So note that some researchers prefer to limit the macro level to whole societies, using the term mesotheory for an intermediate level between macro and micro, studying organizations, communities, and perhaps social categories such as gender. Interesting. Never heard of mesotheory before. Anyway, some scholars have taken a more intimate view of social life. Microtheory deals with issues of social life at the level of individuals and small groups. Dating behavior, jury deliberations, and student faculty interactions are apt subjects for a micro-theoretical perspective. Such studies often come close to the realm of psychology, but whereas psychologists typically focus on what goes on inside humans, social scientists study what goes on between them. The basic distinction between macro and micro theory cuts across the other paradigms we'll examine. Some of them, such as symbolic interactionism and ethnomethodology, are often limited to the micro level. Others, such as conflict paradigm, can be pursued at either the micro or the macro level. Early positivism. When the French philosopher Auguste Comte, 1798, died 1857, coined the term sociologie in 1822, he launched an intellectual adventure that continues to unfold today. Most importantly, Comte identified society as a phenomenon that can be studied scientifically. Initially, he wanted to label his enterprise social physics, but that term was taken over by another scholar. Prior to Comte's time, society simply was, to the extent that people recognize different kinds of societies or changes in society over time. Religious paradigms generally predominated in explanations of such differences. People often saw the state of social affairs as a reflection of God's will. Alternatively, people were challenged to create a city of God on earth to replace sin and godlessness. Going here to Craig Mack, I think I'll hit Kosovo first. That's my flavor. So, Pristina, correct. How you holding up in Hungary? Doing quite well here in Hungary. Got the apartment still here. Got the rent taken care of. Light bill paid. Internet paid. Still going to the gym. Fridge full. Tuition paid. Everything's good. Just a hardworking black man trying to make it in corporate America. And yeah, enjoy Pristina. Pristina's hella cheap, and you'll find some big titty women. That's what you'll see. Anyway, continuing here. Auguste Comte separated his inquiry from religion. He felt that religious belief could be replaced with scientific study and objectivity. His positive philosophy postulated three stages of history. A theological stage predominated throughout the world until about 1300 CE. During the next 500 years, a metaphysical stage replaced God with philosophical ideas such as nature and natural law. Comte felt he was launching the third stage of history, in which science would replace religion and metaphysics by basing knowledge on observations through the five senses rather than on belief or logic alone. Comte felt that society could be observed and then explained logically and rationally, and that sociology could be as scientific as biology or physics. Comte's view came to form the foundation for subsequent development of the social sciences. In his optimism for the future, he coined the term positivism to describe this scientific approach, believing that scientific truths could be positively verified through empirical observations and that logical analysis of what was observed and the logical analysis of what was observed. In recent decades, the idea of positivism has come under serious challenges, as we'll see later in this discussion. Social Darwinism. Oh, God. Comte's major work on the positivist philosophy was published between 1830 and 1842. 1 year after the publication of the first volume in that series, a young British naturalist set sail on HMS Beagle, beginning a cruise that would profoundly affect the way we think of ourselves and our place in the world. In 1859, when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, he set forth the idea of evolution through natural selection. Simply put, the theory states that as a species coped with its environment, these individuals most suited to success would be the most likely to survive long enough to reproduce. Those less well suited would perish. Over time, the traits of the survivor would come to dominate the species. As later Darwinians put it, species evolved into different forms through the survival of the fittest. As scholars began to study society analytically, it was perhaps inevitable that they would apply Darwin's ideas to changes in the structure of human affairs. The journey from simple hunting and gathering tribes to large industrial civilizations was easier seen as the evolution of progressively fitter forms of society. Among others, Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903, concluded that society was getting better and better Indeed, his native England had profited greatly from the development of industrial capitalism, and Spencer favored a system of free competition, which he felt would ensure continued progress and improvement. England got rich on slavery. I repeat, England got rich on slavery. That is historically true, not just free capitalism. No, it wasn't just industrial capitalism didn't make it. It was the blood, sweat, and tears of my ancestors in the Americas, which the British greatly profited from the slave trade and from the exporting of the crops that were grown in the Americas by Black African slaves. Okay. Anyway, continuing here. Spencer may even have coined the phrase the survival of the fittest. He certainly believed that this principle was a primary force shaping the nature of society. Social Darwinism or social evolution was a popular view in Spencer's time, although it was not universally accepted. This excerpt from a social science methods textbook published in 1950 illustrates the long-term popularity of the notion that things are getting better and better. The use of atomic energy as an explosive offers most interesting prospects in the civil as in the military field. Atomic explosives may be used for transforming the landscape. They may be used for blasting great holes and trenches in the earth, which can be transformed into lakes and canals. In this way, it may become possible to produce lakes in the midst of deserts, and thus convert some of the worst places in the world into oases and fertile countries. It may also be possible to make the Arctic regions comfortable by providing immense and constant sources of heat. The North Pole might be converted into a holiday resort. This is absolutely wicked that people thought that this was possible. Like, we're going to nuke the North and South Pole and have people like live there in dachas, like Russian dachas. That's crazy. All right. Anyway, quite aside from the widespread disenchantment with nuclear power, contemporary concerns over global warming and the threat of rising sea levels illustrate a growing consciousness that progress is often a two-edged sword. Clearly, most of us operate today from a different paradigm. Conflict paradigm. One of Spencer's contemporaries took a sharply different view of the evolution of capitalism. Karl Marx, born 1818, died 1883, suggested that social behavior could best be seen as a process of conflict, the attempt to dominate others and to avoid being dominated. Marx's conflict paradigm focused primarily on the struggle among economic classes. Specifically, he examined the way capitalism produced the oppression of workers by the owners of industry. Marx's interest in this topic did not end with analytical study. He was also ideologically committed to restructuring economic relations to end the oppression he observed. All right, and a definition of positivism introduced by Auguste Comte, this philosophical system is grounded on the rational proof or disproof of scientific assertions, assumes a knowable objective reality. All right, let's go here. So the contrast between the views set forth by Spencer and Marx indicates the influence of paradigms on research. These fundamental viewpoints shape the kinds of observations we are likely to make, the sorts of facts we seek to discover, and the conclusions we draw from those facts. Paradigms also help determine which concepts we see as relevant and important. Whereas economic classes were essential to Marx's analysis, for example, Spencer was more interested in the relationship between individuals and society, particularly the amount of freedom individuals had to surrender for society to function. All right. Greg Mack says, are they down with the brand and do they have pubs with men and women? I'll be there 3 weeks, maybe a month. If you're going to Pristina, of course, yes, there's places to drink and men and women be there. I assume it's mostly downtown. And yeah, mostly downtown. You can have a nice drink, go to the bar, have fun. And yeah, there's women there all around. And that's all I got to say. That's all I got to say. I don't know about a month in Pristina in this weather. It's about to get really cold. It's about to be really cold down there. It's really cold because it has a high elevation. But good luck. Enjoy. All right. The conflict paradigm proved to be fruitful outside the realm of purely economic analysis. George Simmel, born 1858 and died 1918, was specifically interested in small-scale conflict, in contrast to the class struggle that interested Marx. Simmel noted, for example, that conflicts among members of a tightly knit group tended to be more intense than those among people who did not share feelings of belonging and intimacy. in an interesting application of the conflict paradigm. When Mikhail Chossudovsky's 1997 analysis of the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and World Bank suggested that these two international organizations were increasing global poverty rather than eradicating it. He directed his attention to the competing interest involved in the process. In theory, the chief interest being served should be that of the poor people of the world, or perhaps the impoverished nations. The researchers' inquiry, however, identified many other interested parties who benefited: the commercial lending institutions who made loans in conjunction with the IMF and World Bank, as well as multinational corporations seeking cheap labor and markets for their goods. For example, Chusodovsky concluded that the interests of the banks and corporations tended to make precedence over those of the poor people. Moreover, he found that many policies were weakening the economies in developing nations as well as undermining democratic governments. Although the conflict paradigm often focuses on class, gender, and ethnic struggles, we could appropriately apply it whenever different groups have competing interests. For example, we could fruitfully apply it to understanding relations among different departments in an organization, fraternity and sorority rush weeks, or student-faculty administrative relations, to name just a few. Okay. All right, going one more time to the definition. Conflict theory, a paradigm that views human behavior as attempts to dominate others or avoid being dominated by others. Interesting. All right. So symbolic interactionism. Okay, we're breaking down all the paradigms of talking about race, mostly because I was first introduced to conflict theory and symbolic interactionism a few weeks ago when I started, studying about race, right? How sociologists view race and the frameworks they use to think about race. So yeah, very, very interesting that these are the frameworks we're talking about here. Sociology is basically the study of white supremacy and anti-blackness. Let's keep it a buck. Let's keep it absolutely real. Sociology is essentially the study of anti-blackness and white supremacy in general. That's what it is. I mean, it's coming up at the same time that capitalism begins to become fully formed, and we have the modern beginnings. We have the modern beginnings of the world we have today. You know what I mean? So it's not a. I'm not shocked that a lot of this stuff is focusing on race. Anyway, continuing here. In his overall focus, George Simmel differed from both Spencer and Marx. Whereas they were chiefly concerned with macro theoretical issues, large institutions and whole societies and their evolution through the course of history, Simmel was more interested in how individuals interacted with one another. In other words, his thinking and research took a micro term, thus calling attention to aspects of social reality that are invisible in Marx's or Spencer's theory. For example, he began by examining dyads, groups of two people, and triads, groups of three. Similarly, he wrote about the web of group affiliations. Simmel was one of the first European sociologists to influence the development of U.S. sociology. His focus on the nature of interactions particularly influenced George Herbert Mead, born 1864, died 1921, and others who took up the cause and developed into a powerful paradigm for research. Cooley, for example, introduced the idea of the primary group, those intimate associates with whom we share a sense of belonging, such as our family and friends. Cooley also wrote of the looking glass self we form by looking into the reactions of people around us. If everyone treats us as beautiful, for example, we conclude that we are. Notice how fundamentally the concepts and theoretical focus inspired by this paradigm differ from the society-level concerns of Spencer and Marx. Continuing here. Mead emphasized the importance of our human ability to take the role of the other. Imagine how others feel and how they might behave in certain circumstances. As we gain an idea of how people in general see things, we develop a sense of what Mead called the generalized other. Strauss, 1977. Interesting stuff here. Mead also showed a special interest in the role of communications in human affairs. Most interactions, he felt, revolved around the process of individuals reaching common understanding through the use of language and other such systems, hence the term symbolic interactionism. This paradigm can lend insights into the nature of interactions in ordinary social life, but it can also help us understand unusual forms of interaction, as when researchers Robert Emerson, Carrie Ferris, and Carol Gardner in 1998, in a study still relevant today, set out to understand the nature of stalking. Through interviews with numerous stalking victims, they came to identify different motivations among stalkers, stages in the development of a stalking scenario, how people can recognize if they are being stalked, and what they can do about it. Moving from the topic of stalking, here's one way you might apply the symbolic interactionism paradigm to a less dramatic examination of your own life. The next time you meet someone new, pay attention to how you get to know each other. To begin, what assumptions do you make about the other person based merely on appearance, how he or she talks, and the circumstances under which you've met? What's someone like you doing in a place like this? Then watch how your knowledge of each other unfolds through the process of interaction. Notice also any attempts you make to manage the image you are creating in the other person's mind. Interesting. So, ethno-methodology. Whereas some social science paradigms emphasize the impact of social structure on human behavior, that is, the effects of norms, values, control agents, and so forth, other paradigms do not. Harold Garfinkel, a contemporary sociologist, claims that people are continually creating social structure through their actions and interactions, that they are, in fact, creating their realities. Thus, when you and your instructor meet to discuss your term paper, even though there are a myriad expectations about how both should act, your conversation will differ somewhat from any of those that have occurred before, and how you each act will somewhat modify your expectations in the future. That is, discussing your term paper will impact the interactions each of you have with other professors and students in the future. Very interesting. Very interesting. Given the tentativeness of reality, oh, sorry. Given the tentativeness of reality in this view, Garfinkel suggests that people are continuously trying to make sense of the life they experience. In a sense, he suggests that everyone is acting like a social scientist, hence the term ethno-methodology, or methodology of the people. How would you approach learning about people's expectations and how they make sense out of their world? One technique ethno-methodologists use is to break the rules, to violate people's expectations. Thus, if you try to talk to me about your term paper, but I keep talking about football, this might reveal the expectations you have for my behavior might become apparent. We might also see how you make sense out of my behavior. Maybe he's using football as an analogy for understanding social systems theory. And another example of ethno-methodology, Johan Heritage and David Greatbach, 1992, examined the role of applause in British political speeches. How did the speaker evoke applause? What function did it serve? Research within the ethno-methodological paradigm has often focused on communications. There's no end to the opportunities you have for trying out the ethno-methodological paradigm. For instance, the next time you get on an elevator, don't face friends watching the floor numbers whip by. That's the norm or expected behavior. Just stand quietly facing the rear. See how others react to this behavior. Just as important, notice how you feel about it. If you do this experiment a few times, you should begin to develop a feel for the ethno-methodological paradigm. That's a bit funny. I should try that in my elevator here. I think people might think I'm going to rob them. Okay. Uh, we'll return to ethno-methodology in chapter 10 when we discuss field research. For now, let's turn to a very different paradigm. I am grateful to my colleague Bernard McGrain for this experiment. Barney has also had his students eat dinner with their hands, watch TV without turning it on, and engage in other strangely enlightening behavior. Interesting. Uh, Symbolic interactionism, one more time, let's read the review. A paradigm that views human behavior as the creation of meaning through social interactions, with those meanings, conditions, subsequent interactions. That's it. Interesting. So, structural functionalism. So, structural functionalism, sometimes also known as social systems theory, has grown out of a notion introduced by Comte and Spencer. A social entity, such as an organization or a whole society, can be viewed as an organization. Like other organisms, a social system is made up of parts, each of which contributes to the functioning of the whole. By analogy, consider the human body. Each component, such as the heart, lungs, kidneys, skin, and brain, has a particular job to do. The body as a whole cannot survive unless each of these parts does its job, and none of the parts can survive except as a whole, as a part of the whole body. Or consider an automobile. It is composed of the tires, the steering wheel, the gas tank, the spark plugs, and so forth. Each of the parts serves a function for the whole. Taken together, that system can get us across town. None of the individual parts would be very useful to us by itself, however. The view of society as a social system then looks for the functions served by its various components. Social scientists, using the structural functional paradigm, might note that the function of the police, for example, is to exercise social control, encouraging people to abide by the norms of society and bring into justice those who do not. Notice, though, that the researchers could just as reasonably ask what functions criminals serve in society. Within the functionalist paradigm, we might say that criminals serve as job security for the police. That's crazy. In a related observation, Emil Durkheim suggested that crimes and their punishment provide an opportunity to reaffirm society's values. By catching and punishing thieves, we reaffirm our collective respect for private property. Interesting. Yeah, Durkheim has some wild views about crime. Essentially, a healthy society has crime. All right, crime is natural in society. Anyway, to get a sense of the structural functional paradigm, suppose you were interested in explaining how your college or university works. You might thumb through the institution's catalog and begin assembling a list of the administrators and support staff, such as the president, deans, registrar, campus security staff, maintenance personnel, etc. Okay, then you might figure out what each of them does and relate their roles and activities to the chief functions of your college or university, such as teaching or research. This way of looking at an institution of higher learning would clearly suggest a different line of inquiry than, say, a conflict paradigm, which might emphasize the clash of interests between people who have power in the institution and those who don't. All right, going here to the comments right here. Greg Matt says, I have not been getting your notifications. When are you going to start talking politics? Your prediction, mass shooting in Orlando, 8 shot, 2 dead. Sounds about a normal day. I predict Kamala is going to win, though it might be tight. I imagine she's going to win Georgia. I imagine she'll win Georgia. She's going to lose Michigan. She'll win Pennsylvania. She'll win North Carolina. And maybe she'll win Nevada. Maybe she'll win Nevada or Arizona, one of them. And Trump might win Wisconsin. Trump might win Michigan. You know what I'm saying? Trump might win those states. I can see that happening. But I see her winning at least 3 of the swing states, and that's enough for her to win. She got California, New York, Maine, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. That's my prediction. Let me know what you think about the election. Anyway, going here, continuing on in the story. So people often discuss functions in everyday conversation. Typically, however, the alleged functions are seldom tested empirically. Some people argue, for example, that welfare intended to help the poor actually harms them in a variety of ways. It is sometimes alleged that welfare creates a deviant, violent subculture in society, at odds with the mainstream. From this viewpoint, welfare programs actually result in increased crime rates. Lance Hannon and James DeFranzo decided to test this last assertion. Contrary to the beliefs of some, their data indicated that higher welfare payments were associated with lower crime rates. In other words, welfare programs have the function of decreasing rather than increasing lawlessness. In applying the functionalist paradigm to everyday life, people sometimes make the mistake of thinking that functionality, stability, and integration are necessarily good, or that the functionalist paradigm makes that assumption. However, when social researchers look for the functions served by poverty, racial discrimination, or the oppression of women, they are not justifying them. Just the opposite. They seek to understand the function such things play in the larger society as a way of understanding why they persist and how they could be eliminated. Feminist paradigms. When Ralph Linton concluded his anthropological classic, The Study of Man, speaking of a store of knowledge that promises to give man a better life than any he has known, no one complained that he had left out women. Linton was using the linguistic conventions of his time. He implicitly included women in his references to men. Or did he? When feminists first began questioning the use of masculine pronouns and nouns whenever gender was ambiguous, their concerns were often viewed as petty, even silly. At most, many felt the issue was one of women having their feelings hurt, their egos bruised. But be honest, when you read Linton's words, what did you picture? An amorphous, genderless human being or a man? In a similar way, researchers looking at the social world from a feminist paradigm have called attention to aspects of social life that other paradigms do not reveal. In part, feminist theory and research have focused on sex role differences and how they relate to the rest of social organization. These lines of inquiry have drawn attention to the oppression of women in many societies, which in turn has shed light on oppression generally. Feminist paradigms not only reveal the treatment of women or the experience of oppression, but often point to limitations in how others aspects of social life are examined and understood. Thus, feminist perspectives are often related to a concern for the environment, for example. As Greta Gard suggests, the way in which women and nature have been conceptualized historically in Western intellectual tradition has resulted in devaluing whatever is associated with women, emotion, nature, animals, nature, and the body, while simultaneously elevating in value those things associated with men, reason, humans, culture, and the mind. One task of ecofeminism has been to expose these dualisms and the ways in which feminizing nature and naturalizing or animalizing women has served as justification for the domination of women, animals, and the earth. Feminist paradigms have also challenged the prevailing notions concerning consensus in society. Most descriptions of the predominant beliefs, values, and norms of a society are written by people representing only portions of society. In the United States, for example, such analyses have typically been written by middle class white men. Not surprisingly, they have written about the beliefs, values, and norms they themselves share. Though George Herbert Mead spoke of the generalized other that each of us becomes aware of and can take the role of, feminist paradigms question whether such a generalized other even exists. Mead used the example of learning to play baseball to illustrate how we learn about the generalized other. As shown here, Janet Lever's research suggests that understanding the experience of boys may tell us a little bit about girls, may tell us little about girls. All right. As shown here, Janet Lever's research suggests that understanding the experiences of boys may tell us little about girls. Girls play and Girls' play and games are very different. They are mostly spontaneous, imaginative, and free of structure or rules. Turn-taking activities like jump rope may be played without setting explicit goals. Girls have far less experience with interpersonal competition. The style of their competition is indirect rather than face-to-face, individual rather than team-affiliated. Leadership roles are either missing or randomly filled. Social researchers' growing recognition of the intellectual differences between men and women led the psychologist Mary Field Bellingke and her colleagues to speak of women's ways of knowing. 1986. In-depth interviews with 45 women enabled the researchers to distinguish 5 perspectives on knowing that challenged the view of inquiry as obvious and straightforward. There's silence. Some women, especially in early life, feel themselves isolated from the world of knowledge, their lives largely determined by external authorities. Receive knowledge. From this perspective, women feel themselves capable of taking in and holding knowledge originating with external authorities. Subjective knowledge. This perspective opens up the possibility of personal, subjective knowledge, including intuition. Procedural knowledge. Some women feel they have learned the ways of gaining knowledge through objective procedures. Feminist paradigms. Paradigms that one, view and understand society through the experiences of women, and or two, examine generally deprived statuses of women in society. Interesting. All right, procedural knowledge. Is there more? Okay, there's constructed knowledge. Constructed knowledge. The authors describe this perspective as a position in which women view all knowledge as contextual, experience themselves as creators of knowledge, and value both subjective and objective strategies for knowing. Constructed knowledge is particularly interesting in the context of our previous discussions. The positivist paradigm of Comte would have a place neither for subjective knowledge, nor the idea that truth might vary according to its context. The ethno-methodological paradigm, on the other hand, would accommodate these ideas. Feminist standpoint theory is a term often used in reference to the fact that women have knowledge about their status and experience that is not available to men. Introduced by Nancy Hartsock, 1983, this viewpoint has evolved over time. For example, scholars have come to recognize that there is no single female experience, that different kinds of women, varying by wealth, ethnicity, or age, for example, have very different experiences of life and society, all the while sharing some things in common because of their gender. This sensitivity to variations in the female experience is also a main element in what is referred to as third wave feminism, which began in the 1990s. To try out feminist paradigms, you might want to explore whether discrimination against women exists at your college or university. Are the top administrative positions held equally by men and women? How about secretarial and clerical positions? Are men's and women's sports supported equally? Read through the official history of your school. Is it a history that includes men and women equally? If you attend an all male or an all female school, of course, some of these questions won't apply. As we just saw, feminist paradigms reflect not only a concern for the unequal treatment of women, but also an epistemological recognition that men and women overall perceive and understand society differently. Social theories created solely by men, which has been the norm, run the risk of an unrecognized bias. A similar case can be made for theories created almost exclusively by white people. Interesting. Here we go. We're getting to the nitty gritty. We're getting to the nitty gritty, titty titty. Let's go. Let's go. Critical race theory, a paradigm grounded in race awareness and an intention to achieve racial justice. Interest convergence, the thesis that majority group members will only support the interest of minorities when those actions also support the interest of the majority group. Let's go, Earl Babbie. Let's go, let's go, let's go. Let's go, let's go. Let's go. Can't wait. Let's go. Critical race theory. So the roots of critical race theory are generally associated with the civil rights movement of the mid-1950s and race-related legislation of the 1960s. By the mid-1970s, with fears that the strides towards equality were beginning to bog down, civil rights activists and social scientists began the codification of a paradigm based on race awareness and commitment to racial justice. This was not the first time sociologists paid attention to the status of non-whites in U.S. society. Perhaps the best-known African-American sociologist in the history of the discipline was W.E.B. Du Bois, who published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. I got to read that book again. I read it when I was much younger, but I know I would appreciate it now. Among other things, Du Bois pointed out that African Americans live their lives through a dual consciousness, as Americans and as Black people. By contrast, white Americans have seldom reflected on being white. If you were American, white was simply assumed. If you were not white, you have been seen and made to feel like the exception. So imagine the difference between an African American sociologist and a white sociologist creating a theory of social identity. Their theories of identity would likely differ in some fundamental ways, even if they were not limiting their analyses to their own race. Much of the contemporary scholarship in critical race theory has to do with the role of race in politics and government, studies often undertaken by legal scholars as well as social scientists. Thus, for example, Derek Bell, 1980, critiqued the U.S. Supreme Court's educational equality for African American students. Once again, Derek Bell suggested that the court was motivated by the economic and political interest of the whites, not by the objectives of educational equality for African American students. In his analysis, Ball, is it Ball or Bell? Derek Ball or Derek Bell? I believe it's Bell. In his analysis, Derek Bell introduced the concept of interest convergence, suggesting that laws will only be changed to benefit African Americans if and when those changes are seen to further the interests of whites. Richard Delgado provides an excellent overview of how Bell's reasoning has been pursued by subsequent critical race theory scholars. As a general rule, whenever you find the word critical in the name of a paradigm or theory, it will likely refer to a non traditional view, one that may be at odds with the prevailing paradigms of an academic discipline and also at odds with the mainstream structure of society. All right. Rational objectivity reconsidered. We began this discussion of paradigms with Comte's assertion that society can be studied rationally and objectively. Since this time, the growth of science and technology, together with the relative decline of superstition, have put rationality more and more at the center of social life. As fundamental as rationality is to most of us, however, some contemporary scholars have raised questions about it. For example, positivistic social scientists have sometimes erred in assuming that humans always acted rationally. I'm sure your own experience offers ample evidence to the contrary. Yet many modern economic models fundamentally assume that people will have rational choices in the economic sector. They will choose the highest paying job, pay the lowest price, and so forth. This assumption ignores the power of tradition, loyalty, image, and other factors that compete with reason and calculation in determining human behavior. A more sophisticated positivism would assert that we can rationally understand and predict even non-rational behavior. An example is the famous Asch experiment, Asch 1958. In this experiment, a group of subjects is presented with a set of lines on a screen and asked to identify the two lines that are equal in length. Imagine yourself a subject in such an experiment. You are sitting in the front row of a classroom among a group of 6 subjects. A set of lines is projected on the wall in front of you. The experimenter, all right, hold on. Let me check something real quick. Got a message from work. All right. Yeah, I'll let them know. All right. All right. Hold on. It's up to date. Had to send that message to my boss real quick. Apologies. Anyway, let me jump back here. Let's jump back to the story. Okay. Greg Mack says Derek Bell is a baseball player. No, Derek Bell is a social scientist. He might be a baseball player too. Who knows? Who knows? He might be a baseball player too. Anyway, continuing here. Imagine yourself a subject in such an experiment. You are sitting in the front row of a classroom among a group of 6 students. A set of lines is projected on the wall in front of you. See figures 2 and 1. The experimenter asks each of you, one at a time, to identify the line on the right that matches the length of line X. The correct answer, B, is pretty obvious. Okay? The Asch experiment. Subjects in the Asch experiment have a seemingly easy task to determine whether A, B, or C is the same length as X. Okay? But there's more here than meets the eye. Yeah, it looks easy. It looks like B is the same as X, right? I think we would all assume that. B and X look the same. Maybe. Yeah, maybe. No. Anyway, to your surprise, however, you find that all of the other subjects agree on a different answer. The experimenter announces that all but one of the group has gotten the correct answer. Because you are the only one who has chosen B, this amounts to saying that you've gotten it wrong. Then a new set of lines is presented, and you have the same experience. What seems to be the obvious correct answer is said by everyone else to be wrong. As it turns out, of course, you're the only real subject in this experiment. All the others are working with the experimenter. The purpose of the experiment is to see whether you will be swayed by public pressure to go along with the incorrect answer. In his initial experiments, all of which involved young men, Asch found that a little over 1/3 of his subjects did just that. Choosing an obviously wrong answer in a simple experiment is an example of non-rational behavior. But as Asch went on to show, experimenters can examine the circumstances that lead more or fewer subjects to go along with this incorrect answer. For example, in subsequent studies, Asch varied the size of one group and the number of dissenters who chose the wrong, that is the correct answer. Thus, it is possible to study non-rational behavior rationally and scientifically. More radically, we can question whether social life abides by rational principles at all. In the physical sciences, developments such as chaos theory, fuzzy logic, and complexity have suggested they may need to rethink fundamentally the orderliness of events in the physical world. Certainly the social world might be no tidier. Certainly, the social world might be no tidier than the world of physics. The contemporary challenge to positivism, however, goes beyond the question of whether people always behave rationally in their political, economic, and other areas of behavior. In part, the criticism of positivism challenges the idea that scientists can be as objective as the positivistic ideal assumes. Most scientists would agree that personal feelings can and do influence the problems scientists choose to study, what they choose to observe, and the conclusions they draw from their observations. There is an even more radical critique of the ideal of objectivity. As we glimpsed in the discussions of feminism and ethnomethodology, some contemporary researchers suggest that some subjectivity might actually be preferable in some situations. Let's take a moment to return to the dialectic of subjectivity and objectivity. To begin, all our experiences are inescapably subjective. There is no way out. We can see only through our own eyes, and anything peculiar to our eyes will shape what we see. We can hear things only the way our particular ears and brain transmit and interpret sound waves. You and I, to some extent, hear and see different realities, and both of us experience quite different physical realities than, say, do bats. Go into the comments. Greg Matt says, I'll catch you next live. I personalized your channel. Be safe. Be safe out there too, Craig Matt. Peace to everybody else out there. We're continuing to study and read. I'll be on live for another hour, reading all comments, trying to blow through chapter 2. And then after this, I'm going to do some homework because I'm a hard working, hard studying black man trying to make it in the academia world. All right, let's continue here. So both of us experience quite different physical realities than, say, do bats. In what to us is total darkness, a bat sees things such as flying insects by emitting a sound we humans can't hear. Echolocation, or the reflection of the bat's sound, creates a sound picture precise enough for the bat to home in on the moving insect and snatch it up in its teeth. In a similar vein, scientists on the planet Zandu might develop theories of the physical world based on a sensory apparatus that we humans can't even imagine. Maybe they have X-ray vision or hear colors. Despite the inescapable subjectivity of our experience, we humans seem to be wired to seek an agreement on what is really real, what is objectively so. Objectivity is a conceptual attempt to get beyond our individual views. It is ultimately a matter of communication, as you and I attempt to find a common ground in our subjective experiences. Whenever we succeed in our search, we say we are dealing with objective reality. This is the agreement reality discussed in chapter 1. To this point, perhaps the most significant studies in the history of social science were conducted in the 1930s by a Turkish-American social psychologist, Muzafer Sherif, who slyly said he wanted to study autokinetic effects. To do this, he put small groups in totally darkened rooms, save for a single point of light in the center of the wall in front of the participants. Sherif explained that the lights would soon begin to move about, and the subjects were to determine how far it was moving, a difficult task with nothing else visible as a gauge of length or distance. Okay, Muzafer Sherif sounds like a terrorist. He sounds like a terrorist. All right. Amazingly, each of the groups agreed on the distance the points of light moved about. Oddly, however, the different groups of subjects arrived at different conclusions as to how much the light was moving. Strangest of all, the point of light had remained stationary. If you stare at a fixed point of light long enough, it will seem to move about. Sherif's autokinetic effect. Notice, however, that each of the groups agreed on a specific delusion. The movement of the light was real to them, but it was a reality created out of nothing, a socially constructed reality. Whereas our subjectivity is individual, then our search for objectivity is social. This is true in all aspects of life, not just in science. Whereas you and I prefer different foods, we must agree to some extent on what is fit to eat and what is not, or else there could be no restaurants or grocery stores. The same argument could be made regarding every other form of consumption. Without agreement, reality, there could be no movies or television, no sports. Social scientists as well have found benefits in the concept of a socially agreed on objective reality. As people seek to impose order on their experience of life, they find it useful to pursue this goal as a collective venture. What are the causes and cures of prejudice? Working together, social researchers have uncovered some answers that hold up to intersubjective scrutiny. Whatever your subjective experience of things, for example, you can discover for yourself that as education increases, prejudice generally tends to decrease. Because each of us can discover this independently, we say that it is objectively true. From the 17th century through the middle of the 20th century, however, the belief in an objective reality that people could see and measure ever more clearly predominated in science. For the most part, it was not simply held as a useful paradigm, but held as the truth. The term positivism has generally represented the belief in a logically ordered objective reality that we can come to know better and better through science. This is the view challenged today by postmodernists and others who suggest that perhaps only our perceptions and experiences are real. Some say that the ideal of objectivity conceals as much as it reveals. As we saw earlier in years past, much of what was regarded as objectivity in Western social science was actually an agreement primarily among white, middle class European men. Equally, real experiences common to women, to ethnic minorities, to non Western cultures, or to the poor were not necessarily represented in that reality. Thus, early anthropologists are now criticized for often making modern, westernized sense out of the beliefs and practices of non literate tribes around the world, sometimes by portraying their subjects as superstitious savages. We often call orally transmitted beliefs about the distant past creation myth, whereas we speak of our own beliefs as history. Increasingly today, there is a demand to find the native logic by which various peoples make sense out of life and to understand it on its own terms. Ultimately, we'll never be able to completely distinguish between an objective reality and our subjective experience. We can't know whether our concepts correspond to an objective reality or are simply useful in allowing us to predict and control our environment. So desperate is our need to know what is really real, however, that both positivists and postmodernists are sometimes drawn into the belief that their own view is real and true. There is a dual irony in this. On the one hand, the positivists believe that science precisely mirrors the objective world must ultimately be based on faith. This conviction cannot be proved by objective science because that's precisely what is at issue. And the postmodernists who say nothing is objectively so and everything is ultimately subjective do at least feel that it is really the way things are. Okay? That is really the way things are. Interesting. Okay, so postmodernism is often portrayed as a denial of the possibility of social science, but that's not the point I'm making. This textbook makes no assumption about the existence or absence of an objective reality. At the same time, human beings demonstrate an extensive and robust reality to establish agreements as to what is real. This appears in regards to rocks and trees, as well as ghosts and gods, and even more elusive ideas such as loyalty and treason. Whether something like prejudice really exists, research into its nature can take place because enough people agree that prejudice does exist, and researchers use agreed on techniques of inquiry to study it. Another social science paradigm, critical realism, suggests that we define reality as that which can be seen to have an effect. Since prejudice clearly has an observable effect in our lives, it must be judged real in terms of this point of view. This paradigm fits interestingly with an oft-quoted statement by early U.S. sociologist W.I. Thomas. If men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. I somewhat agree with that. I generally agree with that. Um, Like, for example, race is not real, but it's real in the fact that it has consequences. Gender is not real, but it's real in the fact that it has consequences. We cannot act like it is not real, though it is an unreal thing, meaning that it's something that we create and we are able to make different types of reality out of race. I tend to agree with that. Is there an objective reality? I think so, yes. There is an objective reality in that we exist as far as we perceive it to exist. I wrote about this before many years ago in a piece that I posted on my channel. But yeah, that's my answer. That's my answer to this question. Continuing here. But I don't believe that there's that in positivism. I don't believe that there are social scientific facts like X existing in society will always have Y outcome. I don't agree with that. I tend no. Anyway, continuing here. This book will not require or even encourage you to choose among positivism, postmodernism, or any other paradigms discussed in this chapter. In fact, I invite you to look for value in any and all as you seek to understand the world that may or may not exist around you. Ha ha ha. Oh, you're funny. Oh, Earl, you got jokes, huh? Okay. Anyway, similarly, as social researchers, we are not forced to align ourselves entirely with either positivism or postmodernism. Instead, we can treat them as two distinct arrows in our quiver. Each approach compensates for the weaknesses of the other by suggesting complementary perspectives that can produce useful lines of inquiry. For example, the renowned British physicist Stephen Hawking has elegantly described the appealing simplicity of the positivistic model but tempers his remarks with a recognition of the way science is practiced. What did Stephen Hawking say? He said this. Should I do it in Stephen Hawking voice? According to this way of thinking. Oh, no. Rest in peace, Stephen Hawking. I don't want to go to hell. Anyway, according to this way of thinking, a scientific theory is a mathematical model that describes and codifies the observations we make. A good theory will describe a large range of phenomenon on the basis of a few simple postulates and will make definite predictions that can be tested. If the predictions agree with the observations, the theory survives that test, though it can never be proved to be correct. On the other hand, if the observations disagree with the predictions, one has to discard or modify the theory. At least that is what is supposed to happen. In practice, people often question the accuracy of the observation and the reliability and moral character of those making the observations. Interesting. One more time, let's read these definitions. So postmodernism, what is it? Postmodernism, a paradigm that questions the assumptions of positivism and theories describing an objective reality. And what is critical realism? A paradigm that holds things are real insofar as they produce effects. I tend to agree with that. All right, let's go here. So elements of social theory. As we have seen, paradigms are general frameworks or viewpoints, literally points from which to view. They provide ways of looking at life and are grounded in sets of assumptions about the nature of reality. Where a paradigm offers a way of looking, a theory aims to explain what we see. Theories are systematic sets of interrelated statements intended to explain some aspects of social life. Thus, theories flesh out and specify paradigms. Recall from chapter 1 that social scientists engage in both ideographic and nomothetic explanations. Ideographic explanations seek to explain a limited phenomenon as completely as possible, explaining why a particular woman voted as she did, for example, whereas nomothetic explanations attempt to explain a broad range of phenomenon, at least partially, identifying a few factors that account for much voting behavior in general. Now I get it. It makes more sense. That was a much easier explanation than what he did before in chapter 1. Jesus Christ, that was much easier. Ideographic, explaining why a certain woman voted this way. Nomothetic is explaining why most white women voted for Trump. I got it now. Makes more sense. All right, continuing here. So let's look a little more deliberately now at some of the elements of a theory. As I mentioned in chapter 1, science is based on observation. In social research, observation typically refers to seeing, hearing, and less commonly, touching. Don't touch your students. A corresponding idea is fact. Although for philosophers, fact is as complex a notion as reality, social scientists generally use the term to refer to some phenomenon that has been observed. It is a fact, for example, that Barack Obama defeated Mitt Romney in the 2012 presidential election. I thought he was going to say, it is a fact Barack Obama is black. I was going to be like, Babbie, you out of control. All right. Scientists aspire to organize many facts under rules called laws. Abraham Kaplan, 1964, page 91, define laws as universal generalizations about classes of facts. The law of gravity is a classic example. Bodies are attached to each other in proportion to their masses and in inverse proportion to the distance separating them. Laws must be truly universal, however, not merely accidental patterns found among a specific set of facts. It is a fact, Kaplan points out, 1964, page 92, that in each of the U.S. presidential elections from 1920 to 1960, the major candidate with the longest name won. What? Is that really how we're choosing presidents? Who had a longer name? Donald, John, Trump, Hillary, Rodham, Clinton. Okay, so that was only in 1920 to 1960. I guess back then having a long ass name was fancy. Now it's just ghetto or white trash, like Billy Ray Cyrus. You get what I'm saying? I don't know. Anyway, that is not a law, however, as shown by elections since. The earlier pattern was a coincidence. Okay, so it was just a coincidence. That's what he's trying to get at. Anyway, sometimes called principles, laws are important statements about what is so. We speak of them as being discovered, granting, of course, that our paradigms affect what we choose to look for and what we see. Laws in and of themselves do not explain anything. They just summarize the way things are. Explanation is a function of theory, as we'll see shortly. There are no social science laws that claim the universal certainty of those of the natural sciences. Social scientists debate among themselves whether such laws will ever be discovered. Perhaps social life essentially does not abide by invariant laws. This does not mean that social life is so chaotic as to defy prediction and explanation. As we saw in chapter 1, social behavior falls into patterns, and those patterns quite often make perfect sense, although we may have to look below the surface to find the logic. And as I just indicated, laws should not be confused with theories. Whereas a law is an observed regularity, a theory is a systematic explanation for observation that relates to a particular aspect of life. For example, someone might offer a theory of juvenile delinquency, prejudice, or political revolution. Theories explain observations by means of concepts. Jonathan Turner, 1989, page 5, calls concepts the basic building blocks of theory. Concepts are abstract elements representing classes of phenomena within the field of study. The concepts relevant to a theory of juvenile delinquency, for example, include juvenile and delinquency, for starters. A peer group, the people you hang around with, and identify with, is another relevant concept. Social class and ethnicity are undoubtedly relevant concepts in a theory of juvenile delinquency. School performance might also be relevant. A variable is a special kind of concept. Some of the concepts just mentioned refer to things and others refer to sets of things. As we saw in chapter 1, each variable comprises a set of attributes. Thus, delinquency, in the simplest case, is made up of delinquent and not delinquent. A theory of delinquency would aim at explaining why some juveniles are delinquent and others are not. Axioms or postulates are fundamental assertions taken to be true, on which a theory is grounded. In a theory of juvenile delinquency, we might begin with axioms such as everyone desires material comforts, and the ability to obtain material comforts legally is greater for the wealthy than for the poor. From these, we might proceed to propositions, special conclusions derived from the axiomatic groundwork about the relationships among concepts. From our beginning axioms about juvenile delinquency, for example, we might reasonably formulate the proposition that poor youths are more likely to break the law to gain material comforts than are rich youths. This proposition incidentally accords with Robert Merton's classic attempt to account for deviance in society. Merton, 1957, page 139 to 157, I guess, spoke on the agreed on means and ends of society. In Merton's model, non-deviants are those who share the societal agreement as to desired ends, such as a new car, and the means prescribed for achieving them, such as to buy it. One type of deviant, Merton called this type the innovator, agrees on the desired end, but does not have access to the prescribed means for achieving it. Innovators find another method, such as crime, for attaining the desired end. Why didn't anybody think of that before? I'm not a criminal, sir. I'm an innovator. We all desire houses, cars, purses, Gucci bags. I am not a criminal. I'm not a thief. I'm not a robber. I am an innovator, sir. I'm innovating the way to achieve desired things in society. Yeah, yeah, that's what I'm gonna tell them. I'm gonna rob a bank and tell them I'm an innovator. I swear, sociologists have the worst views on crime. They have the funniest interpretations on crime. Durkheim thought crime was like healthy for society. Merton thought like crime is like innovation. Like this is just wild. Like sociologists in general are just wild. Like just wild boys, just making up shit as they go. Anyway, Nelson says, Simon the Shell, please do it next week so I can join in. I'm sick. I've been sick too, man. We're gonna review Ghost in the Shell. I forgot to do that, but we're gonna have that on the list. We got a Portuguese movie coming. Would like for you to know if you've seen it, Nelson. Have you seen My Mother's Eyes? I think it's called My Mother's Eyes. We watched it last night. It's only about an hour 15. Good movie. Good horror movie. Good for a Halloween scare. Check it out, Nelson, if you haven't seen it, because we're going to review that. It's a Portuguese film, so it'll be interesting to have your take on it. Anyway, continuing here. So, from propositions, in turn, we can derive hypotheses. A hypothesis is a specified, testable expectation about empirical reality that follows from a more general proposition. Thus, a researcher might formulate the hypothesis. Poor youths have higher delinquency rates than do rich youths. Research is designed to test hypotheses. In other words, research will support or fail to support a theory only indirectly by testing specific hypotheses that are derived from theories and propositions. Let's look more clearly at how theory and research come together. So, two logical systems revisited. Two logical systems revisiting. All right. Nelson says he hasn't seen it yet. I suggest going to F'd Up Movies and check it out. You can find it on F'd Up Movies. It's very short. And plus, you know, on my Twitter page, I always post up the links to all these films that you can watch them for free. You go to my Twitter feed, it's like a library of movies. Basically, every movie we've seen, you can watch there for free. So, but yeah, go to F'd Up Movies, check out My Mother's Eyes, Portuguese film, horror movie, jump in for the review. And yes, Ghost in the Shell will get done. I promise you. Let's look here. Two logical systems revisited. The traditional model of science. So most of us have a somewhat idealized picture of the scientific method. It is a view gained as a result of the physical science education we've received ever since our elementary school days. Although this traditional model of science tells only a part of the story, it's helpful to understand its logic. There are three main elements in the traditional model of science: theory, operationalization. Operationalization. I can't speak. Operationalization. Blah, 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 blah. Operationalism. Yeah, I'll say that. That's better. All right. And observation. At this point, we're already well acquainted with the idea of theory, but let's review it anyway. Why not? So, theory. According to the traditional model of science, scientists begin with a thing. Scientists begin with a thing. According to the traditional model of science, scientists begin with a thing from which they derive testable hypotheses. For example, as social scientists, we might have a theory about the causes of juvenile delinquency. Let's assume that we have arrived at the hypothesis that delinquency is inversely related to social class. That is, as social class goes up, delinquency goes down. Operationalization. To test any hypothesis, we must specify the meanings of all the variables involved in it. In observational terms, in the present case, the variables are social class and delinquency. To give these terms specific meaning, we might define delinquency as being arrested for crime, being convicted of a crime, or some other plausible phrase. Whereas social class might be specified in terms of family income for the purpose of this particular study. Once we have defined our variables, we need to specify how we'll measure them. Recall from chapter 1 that science, in the classical ideal, depends on measurable observations. Operationalization literally means specifying the exact operations involved in measuring a variable. There are many ways we can attempt to test our hypothesis, each of which allows for different ways of measuring our variables. For simplicity, let's assume we're planning to conduct a survey of high school students. We might operationalize delinquency in the form of the question, have you ever stolen anything? Those who answer yes will be classified as delinquents in our study. Those who say no will be classified as non delinquents. Similarly, we might operationalize social class by asking respondents, what was your family's income last year? And providing them with a set of family income categories under $10,000, $10,000 to $24,000, $25,000 to basically $50,000, $50,000 to basically $90,000 or $100,000, and $100,000 and above. At this point, someone might object that delinquency can mean something more than or different from having stolen something at one time or another, or that social class isn't necessarily the same as family income. I mean, that's a good point. But yeah, when did delinquency relate to child crime? I thought delinquency was just, missing school. I thought delinquency, or that's truancy, right? Truancy is when kids miss school. Delinquency, I guess, can be crime, I guess. All right. Anyway, I don't speak English. Some parents might think body piercing is a sign of delinquency, even if their children don't steal. And to some, social class might include an element of prestige or community standing, as well as how much money a family has, and race as well. For the researcher testing a hypothesis, however, the meaning of variables is exactly and only what the operational definition specifies. In this respect, scientists are very much like Humpty Dumpty and Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, 1895. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty tells Alice, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, Alice replies, whether you can make words mean so many different things. To which Humpty Dumpty responds, the question is, which is to be master? And that's all. All right, jumping into the comments here. I innovated as on a snow bunny who was getting out of line. Interesting. Exactly, Nelson. Like, we're not doing crime, we're doing innovation. We're doing innovation. It's not crime, it's innovation, according to the sociologists. Anyway, this live stream ain't for everybody. I'm just letting y'all know this is boring Simon study time for school. You get what I'm saying? My channel, it's meant to share stuff with the public, but it's also like meant for me. So like I'm on this, reading this book because when I read on live stream, I'm locked in, I'm focused, I have no distractions. And that's why I like reading on live stream. Plus, it's also a great way to review what I just read. I can listen to it later. Anyway, let's go over the definition of hypothesis one more time. Hypothesis, a specified testable expectation about empirical reality that follows from a more general proposition. More generally, an expectation about the nature of things derived from a theory. It is a statement of something that ought to be observed in the real world if the theory is correct. Okay, so going here, was there another definition? Let's go here. Operationalization, one step beyond conceptualization. Operationalization is the process of developing operational definitions or specifying the exact operations involved in measuring a variable. An operational definition, the concrete and specific definition of something in terms of the operations in which observations are to be categorized. The operational definition of earning an A in this course might be correctly answering at least 90% of the final exam questions. All right, those are very clear definitions. Very clear, very clear. All right, so continuing here. Scientists have to be masters of their operational definitions for the sake of precision in observation, measurement, and communication. Otherwise, we would never know whether a study that contradicted ours did so only because it used a different set of procedures to measure one of the variables and thus change the meaning of the hypothesis being tested. Of course, this also means that to evaluate a study's conclusions about juvenile delinquency and social class or any other variables, we need to know how these variables were operationalized. I hate that word. Operationalized. It's so hard to say. The way we have operationalized the variables in our imaginary study could be open to other problems. However, perhaps some respondents will lie about having stolen anything, in which case we'll misclassify them as non delinquent. Some respondents will not know their family income and will give mistaken answers. Others may be embarrassed and lie. We'll consider issues like these in detail in part two. Our operationalized hypothesis now is that the highest incidence of delinquents will be found among respondents who select the lowest family income category, under $10,000. A low percentage of delinquents will be found in the $10,000 to $24,000 category. Still fewer delinquents will be found in the $25,000 to $50,000 category, and $50,000 to $99,000 category. And the lowest percentage of delinquents will be found in the $100,000 and above category. Now we're ready for the final step in the traditional model of science observation. Having developed theoretical clarity and specific expectations, and having created a strategy for looking, all that remains is to look at the way things actually are. All right. So once again, here's an image of the graph. So the final step in the traditional model of science involves actual observation, looking at the world and making measurements on what is seen. Let's suppose our survey produced the following data. So percentage of delinquents under 10,000, 20%. 10 to 25,000, 15%, 25 to 50,000, 10%, 50,000 to 100,000, 5%, 100,000 and above, 2%. Okay. All right. Clear? Observations producing such data will confirm our hypothesis. But suppose our findings were as follows. All right, percent delinquents, 15%. Yeah, 15% across the board. These findings would disconfirm our hypothesis regarding family income and delinquency. This confirmability, or the possibility of falsification, is an essential quality in any hypothesis. In other words, if there is no chance that our hypothesis will be disconfirmed, it hasn't said anything meaningful. You cannot test whether a hypothesis is true unless your test contains the possibility of deciding it false. Wow, that's deep. That's deep, low key. Your test has to be able to be proven false for it to be even considered to be true, right? Something has to be tested. It cannot just be automatically assumed to be true. That's deep. That's deep. For example, the hypothesis that juvenile delinquents commit more crimes than do non-delinquents cannot possibly be disconfirmed. The hypothesis that juvenile delinquents commit more crimes than non-delinquents cannot possibly be disconfirmed because criminal behavior is intrinsic to the idea of delinquency. Even if we recognize that some young people commit crimes without being caught and labeled as delinquents, they couldn't threaten our hypothesis because our actual observations will lead us to conclude they were law-abiding non-delinquents. Figure 2.2 provides a schematic diagram of the traditional model of scientific inquiry. In it, we see the researcher beginning with an interest in a phenomenon, such as juvenile delinquency. Next comes the development of a theoretical understanding. In this case, that a single concept, such as social class, might explain others. The theoretical considerations result in an expectation about what should be observed if the theory is correct. The notation y equals f times x is a conventional way of saying that y, for example, delinquency, is a function of, depends on, x, for example, social class. At that level, however, X and Y still have rather general meanings that could give rise to different observations and measurements. Operationalization specifies the procedures that will be used to measure the variables. The lowercase y in figure 2.2, for example, is a precisely measurable indicator of capital Y. This operationalization process results in the formation of a testable hypothesis. For example, self-reported theft is a function of family income. Observations aimed at finding out whether this statement accurately describes reality are part of what is typically called hypothesis testing. See the tips and tools box, hints for stating hypotheses for more on the process of formulating hypotheses. Very interesting. Very interesting here. Let's look here. So idea / interest. What causes why? In this case, what causes delinquency? What causes theft? Theoretical understanding. Okay, maybe theft, maybe poverty causes theft, or lower income, lower class status causes theft. Hypothesis. All right. Theft is equal to the function of lower class, right? All right, it's the same thing. Theoretical explanation, operationalization, testable hypothesis. Okay. And so y equals maybe observation, hypothesis testing. Anyway, the traditional image of science, the deductive model of scientific inquiry begins with sometimes vague or general questions, which is subjected to a process of specification, resulting in hypotheses that can be tested through empirical observation. All right, continuing here. All right. So, tips and tools, hints for stating hypotheses. This was written by Riley E. Dunlap, Department of Sociology, Oklahoma State University. A hypothesis is the basic statement that is tested in research. Typically, a hypothesis states a relationship between two variables. Although it is possible to use more than two variables, you should stick to two for now. Because a hypothesis makes a prediction about the relationship between the two variables, it must be testable so you can determine if the prediction is right or wrong when you examine the results obtained in your study. A hypothesis must be stated in an unambiguous manner to be clearly testable. What follows are suggestions for developing testable hypotheses. Assume you have an interest in trying to predict some phenomenon, such as attitudes towards women's liberation, and that you can measure such attitudes on a continuum ranging from opposed to women's liberation to neutral to supportive of women's liberation. Also, assume that, lacking a theory, you'll rely on hunches to come up with variables that might be related to attitudes towards women's liberation. In a case of filling in the blank. Blank is related to attitudes towards women's liberation. Your job is to think of a variable that might plausibly be related to such attitudes, and then to word a hypothesis that states a relationship between the two variables, the one that fills in the blank and attitudes towards women's liberation. You need to do so in a precise manner so that you can determine clearly whether the hypothesis is supported or not when you examine the results. In this case, most likely the results of a survey. The key is to word the hypothesis carefully so that the prediction it makes is quite clear to you as well as others. If you use age, note that saying age is related to attitudes towards women's liberation does not say precisely how you think the two are related. In fact, the only way this hypothesis could be falsified is if you fail to find a statistically significant relationship of any type between age and attitudes towards women's liberation. In this case, a couple of steps are necessary. You have two options. Age is related to attitudes towards women's liberation, with younger adults being more supportive than older adults, or you could state the opposite. If you believed older people are likely to be more supportive. Age is negatively related to support for women's liberation. Note here that I specify support for women's liberation, SWL, and then predict a negative relationship. That is, as age goes up, I predict that SWL will go down. And continuing, in this hypothesis, note that both of the variables, age, the independent variable or likely cause, and SWL, the dependent variable or likely effect, range from low to high. This feature of the two variables is what allows you to use negatively or positively to describe the relationship. Notice what happens if you hypothesize a relationship between gender and SWL. Because gender is a nominal variable, as you'll learn in chapter 5, it does not range from low to high. People are either male or female, the two attributes of the variable gender. Consequently, you must be careful in stating the hypothesis unambiguously. Sex is positively or negatively related to SWL. It is not an adequate hypothesis because it doesn't specify how you expect sex to be related to SWL. That is, whether you think men or women will be more supportive of women's liberation. It's tempting to say something like women are positively related to SWL, but this doesn't really work because female is only an attribute, but a full variable, sex, is the variable, but not a full variable. All right. All right. Female is only of attributes, not a full variable. Okay. Sex is related to SWL, with women being more supportive than men, would be my recommendation. Okay. Or you could say, with men being less supportive than men, with men being less supportive than women, which makes the identical prediction. Of course, you could also make the opposite prediction that men are more supportive than women are if you wished. Equally legitimate would be women are more likely to support women's liberation than are men. Note the need for the second R. Or you could be construed as hypothesizing that women support women's liberation more than they support men. Not quite the same idea. All right. All right. Hypothesis. Fast has baby oil in his lips. That's funny. Is Fast even here? I don't know if you blocked him. If you blocked Fast, unblock Fast, man. Let Fast live. He can be in the chat. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, so the previous examples hypothesize relationships between a characteristic, age or sex, and an orientation, attitudes towards women's liberation. Because the causal order is pretty clear, obviously age and sex come before attitudes and are less alterable. We could state the hypothesis as I've done, and everyone would assume that we were stating causal hypotheses. Finally, you may run across references to the null hypothesis, especially in statistics. Such a hypothesis predicts no relationship, technically no statistically significant relationship between the two variables, and it is always implicit in testing hypotheses. Basically, if you have hypothesized a positive or negative relationship, you are hoping that the results will allow you to reject the null hypothesis and verify your hypothesized relationship. Interesting work here. All right, let's see how much more in chapter 2 we got. Chapter 2 is deep and thick. Chapter 2 is deep and thick, but we're almost done. We're actually almost done with chapter 2. Let's see if we can blow through it in these last 30 minutes. I think I can. I think I can. I know I can. I think I can. I know I can. Let's go. So deductive and inductive reasoning, a case illustration. In chapter 1, I introduced deductive and inductive reasoning with the promise that we would return to them later. It's later. Oh no! As you probably recognize, the traditional model of science just described is a nice example of deductive reasoning. From a general theoretical understanding, the researcher derives, deduces an expectation, and finally a testable hypothesis. This picture is tidy, but in reality, science uses inductive reasoning as well. Let's consider a real research example as a vehicle for comparing the deductive and inductive linkages between theory and research. Years ago, Charles Glock, Benjamin Ringer, and I, in 1967, set out to discover what caused differing levels of church involvement among U.S. Episcopalians. Several theoretical or quasi-theoretical positions suggested possible answers. I'll focus on only one here, what we came to call the comfort hypothesis. In part, we took our lead from the Christian injunction to care for the halt, the lame, the blind, and those who are weary and heavy laden. At the same time, ironically, we noted the Marxist assertion that religion is an opiate for the masses. Given both, it made sense to expect the following, which was our hypothesis. Parishioners whose life situations must most deprive them of satisfaction and fulfillment in the secular society turn to the church for comfort and substitute rewards. Having framed this general hypothesis, we set about testing it. Were those deprived of satisfaction in the secular society, in fact, more religious than those who received more satisfaction from the secular society? To answer this, we needed to distinguish who was deprived. The questionnaire, which was constructed for the purpose of testing the comfort hypothesis, included items that seemed to offer indicators of whether parishioners were relatively deprived or gratified in secular society. To start, we reasoned that men enjoy more status than women do in our generally male-dominated society. Though hardly novel, this conclusion laid the groundwork for testing the comfort hypothesis. If we were correct in our hypothesis, women should appear more religious than men. Once the survey data had been collected and analyzed, our expectation about gender and religion was clearly confirmed. On 3 separate measures of religious involvement, rituals such as church attendance, organizational such as belonging to church organizations, and intellectual such as reading church publications, women were more religious than men. On our overall measure, women scored 50% higher than men. In another test of the comfort hypothesis, we reasoned that in youth-oriented society, old people would be more deprived of secular gratification than the young world. adult. Once again, the data confirmed our expectation. The oldest parishioners were more religious than the middle-aged, who were more religious than young adults. Social class, measured by education and income, afforded another test to the comfort hypothesis. Once again, the test succeeded. Those with low social status were more involved in the church than those with high social status were. The hypothesis was even confirmed in a test that went against everyone's common sense expectations. Go into the comments here. Men enjoy more status because they seek more status with the intention of mating with women. Yes, but there's also men that seek status because they want attention to mate with men, like Diddy. Diddy was trying to get a lot of money because he wanted a lot of pussy. So that's also possible too. The hypothesis was even confirmed in a test that went against everyone's common sense expectations. Despite church posters showing worshipful young families and bearing the slogan, "The family that prays together stays together," the comfort hypothesis suggested that parishioners who were married and had children, the clear American ideal in that time, would enjoy secular gratification in that regard. As a consequence, they should be less religious than those who lacked one or both family components. Thus, we hypothesize that parishioners who are both single and childless should be the most religious. Those with either spouses or child should be somewhat less religious, and those married with children, representing the ideal pictured on all those posters, should be the least religious of all. That's exactly what we found. Null hypothesis. This, in connection with hypothesis testing and tests of statistical significance, that hypothesis suggests there is no relationship among the variable under study. You may conclude that the variables are related after having statistically rejected the null hypothesis. All right. Nelson Moreno says Sam Seals has 2 Diddy posters in his bedroom. Y'all leave Sam Seals alone, man. I don't know what's up with him. I think he just likes to pick on me, man. He's mad because, he's a light-skinned California girl, and, they get sensitive, man. But he sent the super chat, so I appreciate him for the super chat. Hopefully he didn't take it back. But anyway, finally, the comfort hypothesis suggested that the various kinds of secular deprivation should be cumulative. Those with all the characteristics associated with deprivation, those with none should be the least. When we combine the 4 individual measures of deprivation into a composite measure, the theoretical expectation was exactly confirmed. Comparing the 2 extremes, we found that single, childless, elderly, lower-class female parishioners scored more than 3 times as high on the measure of church involvement than did young, married, upper-class fathers. Thus was the comfort hypothesis confirmed. I like this research example because it so clearly illustrates the logic of the deductive model. Beginning with general theoretical expectations about the impact of social deprivation on church involvement, one could derive concrete hypotheses linking specific measurable variables, such as age and church attendance. The actual empirical data could then be analyzed to determine whether empirical reality supported the deductive expectations. I say this example shows how it was possible to address the issue of religiosity deductively, but alas, I've been fibbing. To tell the truth, although we began with an interest in discovering what caused variations in church involvement among Episcopalians, we didn't actually begin with the comfort hypothesis, or any other hypothesis for that matter. The study is actually an example of the inductive model. In the interest of further honesty, Glock and Ringer initiated the study, and I joined it years after the data had been collected. A questionnaire was designed to collect information that might shed a bit of light on why some parishioners participated in the church more than others, but it was not guided by any precise deductive theory. Once the data was collected, the task of explaining differences in religiosity began with an analysis of variables that have a wide impact on people's lives, including gender, age, social class, and family status. Each of these 4 variables was found to relate strongly to church involvement in the ways already described. Indeed, they had a cumulative effect also already described. Rather than being good news, however, this presented a dilemma. Glock recalls discussing his findings with colleagues over lunch at the Columbia Faculty Club. Once he had displayed the tables illustrating the impact of each individual variable, as well as their powerful composite effects, a colleague asked, "What does it all mean, Charlie?" Glock was at a loss. Why were those variables so strongly related to church involvement? That question launched a process of reasoning about what the several variables had in common, aside from their impact on religiosity. Eventually, we saw that each of the four variables also reflected differential status in the secular society. He then had the thought that perhaps the issue of comfort was involved. Thus, the inductive process had moved from concrete observations to a general theoretical explanation. It seems easier to lay out the steps involved in deductive than inductive research. Deductive research begins with a theory from which we may derive hypotheses, which are then tested through observation. Inductive research begins with observations and proceeds with a search for patterns in what we have observed. In a quantitative study, we can search for correlations or relationships between variables, discussed further in Chapter 16. Thus, once a relationship has been discovered between gender and religiosity, our attention turns to figuring out logical reasons why that is so. Most qualitative research is oriented towards the inductive rather than the deductive approach. However, qualitative research does not, by definition, allow us to use statistical tools to find correlations that point towards patterns in need of explanation. See Chapter 14. Although there are computer programs designed for recording and analyzing qualitative data, the qualitative inductive analyst needs a strong reserve of insight and reflection to tease important patterns out of a body of observations. Interesting. Very interesting stuff here. Very interesting stuff here. Continuing. So, as the preceding case illustration shows, theory and research can usefully be done both in inductively and deductively. Figure 2.3 shows a graphic comparison of the two approaches as applied to an inquiry into study habits and performance on exams. In both cases, we are interested in the relationship between the number of hours spent studying for an exam and the grade earned on the exam. Using the deductive method, we would begin by examining the matter logically. Doing well on an exam reflects a student's ability to recall and manipulate information. Both of these abilities should be increased by exposure to the information before the exam. In this fashion, we would arrive at a hypothesis suggesting a positive relationship between the number of hours spent studying and the grade earned on the exams. We say positive because we expect grades to increase as the hours of studying increase. If increased hours produced decreased grades, then that would be called a negative or inverse relationship. The hypothesis is represented by the graph line in part 1A, representing the deductive model in figure 2.3. In part A, we see the expectation of a simple positive linear relationship between the two variables. Part B represents what we observe when we study the two variables. Finally, part C is the need to decide whether the observations are close enough to what was expected to justify accepting the hypothesis. Let's go here. So, deductive method, start with hypothesis. A hypothesis, hours of studying, 40 hours equals better grades, okay? Close to 100. And this is deductive method. Observation, hours studying. We can look at grades. All right, see what happens. The more you study, the higher the grades. Okay. Accept or reject hypothesis. Well, they seem to match. So I would maybe accept the hypothesis that it works. All right. Let's look at the inductive reasoning here. Inductive method. We have observations. We start with the observations. We look at how long people study and their grades. We find the pattern. Okay, something like this, draw a line like this, all right? And the tentative conclusion, the more you study, right, up to a certain point, the better your grades will be on a certain thing. Okay, well, hopefully I get a good grade on this goddamn subject, sociological research, because this stuff is hard. All right, so deductive and inductive methods, figures 2.3. Both deduction and induction are legitimate and valuable approaches to understanding. Deduction begins with an expected pattern that is tested against observations, whereas induction begins with observations and seeks to find a pattern within them. All right. Continuing here. We're almost through with this chapter. We're going to get through it. I think we can. Please. Oh, no, I think there's too many pages. I hope I can. Let's get through it, because I want to finish this chapter before I start my class. I only have 15 minutes, though. But anyway, let's go. So Our next step would be to make observations relevant to testing our hypothesis. The shaded area in part 1b of the figure represents perhaps hundreds of observations of different students, specifically how many hours they studied and what grades they received. Finally, in part 1c, we compare the hypothesis and the observations. Because observations in the real world seldom, if ever, match our expectations perfectly, we must decide whether the match is close enough to consider the hypothesis confirmed. Stated differently, can we conclude that the hypothesis describes the general pattern that exists, granting some variations in real life? Sometimes answering this question necessitates methods of statistical analysis, which will be discussed in part 4 of this book. Now suppose we use the inductive method to address the same research question. In this case, we would begin with a set of observations, as in part 2a of figure 2.3. Curious about the relationship between hours spent studying and grades earned, we might simply arrange to collect relevant data. Then we look for a pattern that best represented or summarized our observations. In part 2b of the figure, the pattern is shown as a curved line running through the center of our observations. The pattern found among the points in this case suggests that with 1 to 15 hours of study, each additional hour generally produces a higher grade on the exam. With 15 to 25 hours, however, more study seems to lower the grades slightly. Studying more than 25 hours, on the other hand, results in a return to the initial pattern. More hours produces higher grades. Using the inductive method, then we end up with a tentative conclusion about the pattern of the relationship between the two variables. The conclusion is tentative because the observations we have made cannot be taken as a test of the pattern. Those observations are the source of the pattern we've created. As I discussed in chapter 1, in actual practice, theory and research interact through a never-ending alteration of deduction and induction. A good example is the classic work of Emil Durkheim on suicide, 1897-1951, when Durkheim pored over table after table of official statistics on suicide rates in different areas. He was struck by the fact that Protestant countries consistently had higher suicide rates than Catholic ones. Why should that be the case? His initial observation led him to create inductively a theory of religion, social integration, enemy, and suicide. His theoretical explanations in turn led deductively to further hypotheses and further observations. The suicide data analyzed by Durkheim pale in comparison with what is now referred to as big data, enormous data sets created through the automatic monitoring of ongoing processes. If you have purchased books, CDs, or anti-itch lotion from Amazon.com or similar containing the online purchases of everyone else, hence you may find yourself looking at a message such as, other people who bought this book also bought this, or your web surfing may be spiced with ads for products or services vaguely related to actions you have previously taken online. If you've ever contributed to a political campaign or signed an online petition, you're very likely to have received related notifications and requests subsequently. Similarly, you have probably read about the controversial bulk data collection programs of the National Security Administration, or NSA, monitoring telephone calls and internet communications for the purpose of identifying possible terrorist connections and activities. The rise in big data collection and processing by commercial, governmental, and other agencies raises serious debates over the prospects for privacy in modern society. In summary, the scientific norm of logical reasoning provides a two-way bridge between theory and research. Scientific inquiry and practice often alternates between deduction and induction. Both methods involve an interplay of logic and observation, and both are roots to the construction of social theories. Although both inductive and deductive methods are valid in scientific inquiry, individuals may feel more comfortable with one approach than the other. Consider this exchange in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's story, A Scandal in Bohemia. A Sherlock Holmes answers Dr. Watson's inquiry. This was written by Doyle in 1891. Yeah. So what do you imagine that it means? I have no data yet. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories, instead of theories to suit facts. Some social scientists would more or less agree with this inductive position. See especially the discussion of grounded theory in chapter 10, whereas others would take a more deductive stance. Most, however, concede the legitimacy of both approaches. With this understanding of the deductive and inductive links between theory and research in hand, let's now delve more deeply into how theories are constructed using either of these two different approaches. Deductive theory construction. To see what's involved in deductive theory construction and hypothesis testing, imagine that you're going to construct a deductive theory. How would you go about it? Getting started. The first step in a deductive theory construction is to pick a topic that interests you. The topic can be very broad, such as what is the structure of society, or it can be narrower, as in why do people support or oppose the idea of a woman's right to an abortion? Whatever the topic, it should be something you're interested in understanding and explaining. Once you've picked your topic, the next step is to undertake an inventory of what's already known or thought about it. In part, this means writing down your own observations and ideas. Beyond that, it means learning what other scholars have said about it. You can talk to other people and you'll want to read the scholarly literature on the topic. Appendix A provides guidelines for using the library. You'll likely spend a lot of time there. Your primary research will probably uncover consistent patterns discovered by prior scholars. For example, religious and political variables will stand out as important determinants of attitudes about abortion. Findings such as these will be very useful to you in creating your own theory. We'll return to techniques of the literature review in more detail as the book continues. In this process, don't overlook the value of introspection. Whenever we can look at our own personal processes, including reactions, fears, and prejudices, we may gain important insights into human behavior in general. I don't mean to say that everyone thinks like you or me, but introspection can provide a useful source of insights that can inform our inquiries. And constructing your theory. Now that you've reviewed previous work on the topic, you're ready to begin constructing your theory. Although theory construction is not a lockstep affair, the process generally involves something like the following steps. Specify the topic. Specify the range of phenomenon your theory addresses. Will your theory apply to all humans? Will your theory apply to all human social life? Will it apply only to US citizens, only to young people, or what? Identify and specify your major concepts and variables. Find out what is known, propositions, about the relationships among those variables. Reason logically from those propositions to the specific topics you're examining. We've already discussed items 1 through 3, so let's focus now 4 and 5. So now let's focus on 4 and 5. As you identify the relevant concepts and discover what's already been learned about them, you can begin to create a propositional structure that explains the topic under study. Let's look now at an example of how these building blocks fit together in deductive theory construction and empirical research. An example of deductive theory. Distributive justice. A topic of interest to scholars is the concept of distributive justice, people's perceptions of whether they are being treated fairly by life, whether they are getting their share. Guillermina Jasso describes the theory of distributive justice more formally as follows. The theory provides a mathematical description of the process whereby individuals reflecting on their holdings of the goods they value, such as beauty, intelligence, or wealth, compare themselves to others, experiencing a fundamental instantaneous magnitude of the justice evaluation, which captures their sense of being fairly or unfairly treated in the distributions of natural and social goods. Notice that Jasso has assigned a symbolic representation for her key variable. J will stand for distributive justice. She does this to support her intention of stating her theory in mathematical formulas. Though theories are often expressed mathematically, we'll not delve too deeply into that practice here. Jasso indicates that there are 3 kinds of postulates in her theory. The first makes explicit the fundamental axiom, which represents the substantive point of departure for the theory. She elaborates as follows. The theory begins with the received axiom of comparison, which formalizes the long-held view that a wide class of phenomenon, including happiness, self-esteem, and the sense of distributive justice, may be understood as the product of a comparison process. Thus, your sense of whether you're receiving a fair share of the good things of life comes from comparing yourself with others. If this seems obvious to you, that's not a shortcoming of the axiom. Remember, axioms are the taken for granted beginnings of theory. Jasso continues to do the groundwork for her theory. First, she indicates that our sense of distributive justice is a function of actual holdings, A, and comparison holdings, C, of some good. Let's consider money, for example. My sense of justice in this regard is a function of how much I actually have, compared with how much others have. By specifying the two components of the comparison, Jasso can use them as variables in her theory. Next, Jasso offers a measurement rule that further specifies how the two variables, A and C, will be conceptualized. This step is needed because some of the goods to be examined are concrete and commonly measured, such as money, whereas others are less tangible, such as respect. The former kind, she says, will be measured conventionally, whereas the latter will be measured by the individual's relative rank within a specially selected comparison group. The theory will provide a formula for making that measurement. Jasso, 1988. Jasso continues in this fashion to introduce additional elements, weaving them into mathematical formulas to be used in deriving predictions about the workings of distributive justice in a variety of social settings. Here is just a sampling of where her theorizing takes her. Other things being the same, a person will prefer to steal from a fellow group member rather than from an outsider. The preference to steal from a fellow group member is more pronounced in poorer groups than in rich groups. In the case of theft, informants arise only in cross group theft, in which case they are members of the thief's group. Persons who arrive a week late at summer camp or for freshman year of college are more likely to become friends of persons who play games of chance than of persons who play games of skill. A society becomes more vulnerable to deficit spending as its wealth increases. Societies in which population growth is welcomed must be societies in which the set of valued goods includes at least one quantity good, such as wealth. Jasso's theory leads to many other propositions, but this sampling should provide a good sense of where deductive theorizing can take you. To get a feeling for how she reasons her way to these propositions, let's look briefly at the logic involved in two of the propositions that relate to theft within and outside one's group. Other things being the same, a person will prefer to steal from a fellow group member than from an outsider. Beginning with the assumption that thieves want to maximize their relative wealth, ask yourself if that goal will be best served by stealing from those you compare yourself with or from outsiders. In each case, stealing will increase your actual holdings, but what about your comparison holdings? That's very deep. So they're saying people would rather steal from their friends because it makes them not only richer, but their friends poorer. Interesting. Interesting. A moment's thoughts should suggest that stealing from people in your comparison group will lower their holdings, further increasing your relative wealth. To simplify, imagine there are only two people in your comparison group, you and I. Suppose we each have $100. If you steal $50 from someone outside our group, you will have increased your relative wealth by 50% compared with me, $150 versus $100. But if you steal $50 from me, you will have increased your relative wealth 200%, $150 to my $50. Your goal is best served by stealing from within the comparison group. In the case of theft, informants arise only in cross group theft, in which case they are members of the thief's group. Can you say why it would make sense for informants, one, to arise only in the case of cross group theft, and two, to come from the thief's comparison group? This proposition again depends on the fundamental assumption that everyone wants to increase his or her relative standing. Suppose you and I are in the same comparison group, but this time the group contains additional people. If you steal from someone else within our comparison group, my relative standing in the group does not change. Although your wealth has increased, the average wealth in the group remains the same because someone else's wealth has decreased by the same amounts. So my relative standing remains the same. I have no incentive to inform on you. If you steal from someone outside your comparison group, however, your nefarious income increases the total wealth in our group. Now, my own wealth relative to that total is diminished. Because my relative wealth has suffered, I'm more likely to inform on you in order to bring an end to your stealing. Hence, informants arise only in cross group theft. Very interesting. That relates a lot to Young Thug and YSL. And I heard Young Thug took a plea deal today, but now it all makes a bit more sense. all makes a bit more sense. Mm, interesting. Interesting. All right, hold on. I just have to check and see if anybody came to this class. I would hate to cut this short because this is now getting so interesting, and I love this topic now because this is absolutely fascinating. But I have to make sure that I don't miss anything. Hold on. All right. I'm just going to set this up here. I just set this up here. Hopefully nobody comes and I can continue rocking out. But if I have to leave abruptly, y'all know what it is. Continuing here. So this last deduction also begins to explain why these informants come to the thief's own comparison group. Come from the thief's own comparison group. This last deduction also begins to explain why these informants come from the thief's own comparison group. We've just seen how your theft decreased my relative standing. How about members of the other group, other than the individual you stole from? Each of them actually profits from the theft because you have reduced the total with which they compare themselves. Hence, they have no reason to inform on you. Thus, the theory of distributive justice predicts that informants arise from the thief's own comparison group. This brief peek into Jasso's derivations should give you some sense of the enterprise of deductive theory. Of course, the theory guarantees none of the given predictions. The role of research is to test each of them to determine whether what makes sense, logic, actually occurs in practice, observation. See the tips and tools box, generating a hypothesis from a theory, for a look at creating hypothesis for deductive purposes, and inductive theory construction. As we have seen, quite often social scientists begin constructing a theory through the inductive method by first observing aspects of social life and then seeking to discover patterns that may point to relatively universal principles. Barney Glasser and Anselm Strauss, 1967, coined the term grounded theory in reference to this method. Field research, the direct observation of events in progress, is frequently used to develop theories through observation. In a long and rich tradition, anthropologists have used this method to good advantage. Among modern social scientists, no one has been more adept at seeing the pattern of human behavior through observation than Erving Goffman. In a research career that stretched from 1950s to the 1970s, a game such as chess generates a habitable universe for those who can follow it, a plane of being, a cast of characters with a seemingly unlimited number of different situations and acts through which to realize their natures and destinies. Yet much of this is reducible to a small set of interdependent rules and practices. If the meaningfulness of everyday activity is similarly dependent on a closed finite set of rules, then explication of them would give one a powerful means of analyzing social life. Life is like a chess game. I think that's what he's saying. So, let's do this. I'm going to finish up this line here, then read the green box. So, in a variety of research efforts, Goffman uncovered the rules of such diverse behaviors as living in a mental institution and managing the spoiled identity of being disfigured. Interesting. In each case, Goffman observed the phenomenon in depth and teased out the rules governing behavior. Goffman's research provides an excellent example of qualitative field research as a source of grounded theory. Our earlier discussion on the comfort hypothesis and church involvement showed that qualitative field research is not the only method of observation appropriate to the development of inductive theory. Here's another detailed example to illustrate further construction of inductive theory using quantitative methods. But before we get to that, we're gonna appear generating a hypothesis from theory. As we have seen, the deductive method of research typically focuses on the testing of a hypothesis. Let's take a minute to look at how to create a hypothesis for testing. Hypotheses state an expected causal relationship between two or more variables. Let's suppose you're interested in student political orientations and your review of the literature and your own reasoning suggest to you that college major will play some part in determining students' political views. Already we have two variables, college major and political orientation. Moreover, political orientation is the dependent variable. You believe it depends on something else, on the independent variable, which in this case is college major. Now we need to specify the attributes comprising each of these variables. For simplicity's sake, let's assume political orientation includes only liberal or conservative. And to simplify the matter of major, let's suppose your research interests focus on the presumed differences between business students and those in the social sciences. Even with these simplifications, you would need to specify more concretely how you would recognize a liberal or conservative when you came across them in your study. This process of specification will be discussed at length in Chapter 5. For now, let's assume you will ask student subjects whether they consider themselves liberal or conservatives, letting each student report on what the term means to them. As we'll see later, this simple dichotomy is unlikely to work in practice, as some students will want to identify themselves as independents or something else. Identifying students' majors isn't as straightforward as you might think. For example, what disciplines compose the social sciences in your study? Also, must students be declared majors or simply be planning to major in one of the relevant fields? Once these issues have been settled, you are ready to state your hypothesis. For example, it might be the following: students majoring in the social sciences will be more likely to identify themselves as liberals than those majoring in business. In addition to the basic expectation, you may wish to specify more likely in terms of how much more likely. Chapter 16 will provide some options in this regard. Deductive theory construction and hypothesis testing offer a clear example of what philosopher Karl Popper, 1934, described as the principle of falsifiability in science. No conclusion can be considered scientific unless it is possible to state observations that would contradict or disprove it. This is what distinguishes scientific conclusions from religious, political, or philosophical beliefs. A belief you hold dear may very well be true, but unless we can agree on circumstances that would disprove it, it cannot be considered proven. All right. And let's go here. An example of inductive theory. Why do people smoke marijuana? During the 1960s and 70s, marijuana use on U.S. college campuses was a subject of considerable discussion in the popular press. Some people were troubled by marijuana's popularity, others welcomed it. What interests us here is why some students smoked marijuana and others didn't. A survey of students at the University of Hawaii by David Takuchi, 1974, provided the data to answer that question. While the reasons and practices regarding pots may have changed, the subtle redefinition of what needed explaining is still instructive. At the time of the study, a huge number of explanations were being offered for drug use. People who opposed drug use, for example, often suggested that marijuana smokers were academic failures trying to avoid the rigors of college life. Those in favor of marijuana, on the other hand, often spoke of the search for new values. Marijuana smokers, they said, were people who had seen through the hypocrisy of middle class values. Takuchi's analysis of the data gathered from University of Hawaii students, however, did not support any of the explanations being offered. Those who reported smoking marijuana had essentially had the same academic records as those who didn't smoke, and both groups were equally involved in traditional school spirit activities. Both groups seemed to feel equally well integrated into campus life. There were other differences between the groups, however. Women were less likely than men to smoke marijuana. Asian students, a large proportion of the student body, were less likely to smoke marijuana than non Asian students. Students living at home were less likely to smoke marijuana than those who were living in their own apartments. Hmm. All right. Well, as in the case of religiosity, the three variables independently affected the likelihood of a student smoking marijuana. At about 10% of the Asian women living at home had smoked marijuana, in contrast to about 80% of the non Asian men living in apartments. And, as in the religiosity study, the researchers discovered a powerful pattern of drug use before they had an explanation for that pattern. In this instance, the explanation took a peculiar turn. Instead of explaining why some students smoked marijuana, the researchers explained why some didn't. Assuming that all the students had some motivation for trying drugs, the researchers suggested that students differed in the degree of social constraints preventing them from following through on that motivation. Basically, they went in there assuming that all the kids liked weed. So, U.S. society is, on the whole, more permissive with men than with women when it comes to deviant behavior. Consider, for example, a group of men getting drunk and boisterous. We tend to dismiss such behavior with references to camaraderie and having a good time, whereas a group of women behaving similarly would probably be regarded with disapproval. We have an idiom: boys will be boys, but no comparable idiom for girls. Yes, we do. Girls just want to have fun. Oh, girls just want to have fun. I think that's a comparable idiom. No? No? Okay. I thought it was. Anyway, continuing here. Uh, Continuing on. So, the researchers reasoned, therefore, that women would have more to lose by smoking marijuana than men would. In other words, being female provided a constraint against smoking marijuana. Students living at home had obvious constraints against smoking marijuana compared with students living on their own. Quite aside from differences in opportunity, those living at home were seen as being more dependent on their parents, hence more vulnerable to additional punishment for breaking the law. Finally, the Asian subculture in Hawaii has traditionally placed a higher premium on obedience to the law than other subcultures have. So Asian students would have more to lose if they were caught violating the law by smoking marijuana. Overall, then, a social constraints theory was offered as the explanation for observed differences in the likelihood of smoking marijuana. The more constraints a student had, the less likely he or she would be to smoke marijuana. It bears repeating that the researchers had no thoughts about such a theory when their research began. The theory came from an examination of the data. All right, the links between theory and research. Throughout this chapter, we have seen various aspects of the links between theory and research in social science inquiry. In the deductive model, research is used to test theories. In the inductive model, theories are developed from the analysis of research data. This final section looks more closely into the ways theory and research are related in actual social science inquiry. Whereas we have discussed two idealized logical models for linking theory and research, social science inquiries have developed a great many variations on these themes. Sometimes theoretical issues are introduced merely as a background for empirical analysis. Other studies cite selected empirical data to bolster theoretical arguments. In neither case do theory and research really interact for the purpose of developing new explanations. Some studies make no use of theory at all, aiming specifically, for example, at an ethnographic description of a particular social situation, such as an anthropological account of food and dress in a particular society. As you read social research reports, as you read social research reports, however, you'll often find that the authors are conscious of the implications of their research for social theories and vice versa. All right. So, research, ethics, and theory. All right. So, yeah, this last paragraph before they get to the main points, summarizing chapter 2, and then we'll do chapter 3 tomorrow. Looking forward to that. All right. Let's continue here. Last paragraph. So research ethics introduced the subject of research ethics and said we would return to that topic throughout the book. At this point, what ethical issues do you suppose theory engenders? In this chapter, we have seen how the paradigms and theories that guide research inevitably impact what is observed and how it is interpreted. Choosing a particular paradigm or theory does not guarantee a particular research conclusion, but it will affect what you look for and what you ignore. Whether you choose a functionalist or a conflict paradigm to organize your research on police community relations, for example, will make a big difference. This is a difficult issue to resolve in practice. Choosing a theoretical orientation for the purpose of encouraging a particular conclusion would be regarded as unethical as a general matter. But when research is linked to an intention to bring about social change, the researcher will likely choose a theoretical orientation appropriate to that intention. Let's say you're concerned about the treatment of homeless people by the police in your community. You might organize your research in terms of interactionist or conflict paradigms and theories that would reveal any instances of mistreatment that may occur. Two factors counter the potential problem of bias from theoretical orientation. First, as we'll see in the remainder of the book, social science research techniques, the various methods of observation and analysis place a damper on our simply seeing what we expect. Even if you expect to find the police mistreating the homeless and use theories and methods that will reveal such mistreatment, you will not observe what isn't there if you apply those theories and methods appropriately. Second, the collective nature of social research offers further protection, as we'll discuss more in Chapter 17. Peer review, in which researchers evaluate each other's efforts, will point to instances of shoddy and or biased research. Moreover, with several researchers studying the same phenomenon, perhaps using different paradigms, theories, and methods, the risk of biased research findings is further reduced. All right, and that's chapter 2. I will read the review covering everything that we studied in chapter 2 next time. I'll also probably do the review assignments here at the end as homework for myself and have the definitions for these words as well. But I really like this book. I'm starting to grasp these concepts a bit more. For social research. Once again, this is not my favorite topic or my favorite part of sociology, but I understand it's an integral part of sociology. So that's why I'm studying it and reading the book with y'all. And it's not that bad. I was intimidated at first. I procrastinated at first. It's a very long book and there's a lot more chapters to do, but we're going to knock it out layer by layer, day by day, chapter by chapter, and get it done so that we understand this concept as best as we can. And I'm going to bug my teacher too. I'm going to send her an email after I read one of these chapters and do the assignments and send the assignments to her so she can like grade it and stuff like that. Shout out to Miss Julia. She's dope. She's a dope teacher. Anyway, this has been a dope live stream. I want to give a shout out to everybody who came in here. Shout out to Nelson Moreno. Shout out to Sam Seals. Shout out to Greg Mack. And shout out to everybody else who tuned in, sent the super chats, all that. This has been Book React 6. If you have a book that you want me to read, that you want me to react to, put it in the comments. I'll try to get to it. I'm going to try to read a lot of my coursework for school, but also this, occasional fun reading as well. I mean, I've been procrastinating on reading like Gucci Mane's book and Boosie Badass's book. So like I got a lot of stuff in the chamber that I want to read, but this is just what's on the plate for right now. So shout out Earl Babbie, shout out all the sociologists out there. We're going to go live tomorrow for chapter 3, reading this, and also be sharing the homework as well if I get a time to do it. And y'all be easy out there. Peace.